from home. Hopefully he's listening to us now. But if not, thank you, Sonny, for providing all the seafood for our reception last night. It was a fun time. With all of that said, and now that we have opened the meeting to begin, the first item on our agenda this morning is the proposed Hudson Canyon National Marine Sanctuary discussion. We have LeAnn Hogan, Matt Brookhart from NOAA's Office of Sanctuaries, and Jessica Coakley, who's our staff lead on this topic. And I'm going to just I think, LeAnn, you're going to go first. Matt's going to go first. Okay. So I'm going to kick things over to Matt to provide us the presentation. I would like to, well, maybe this will be part of the discussion at the end, whether Jessica or Matt or LeAnn bring it up. But I'm hoping that we can provide some recommendation by the end of this topic on today's agenda. So we have a few draft ideas about where we might go with this, and we'll just see where that ends up. So with that said, go ahead, Matt, if you're all ready.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much, Chairman Luisi. Thank you, Mr. Moore, and the rest of the council for giving us a chance to talk to you today about this proposal. We hope we can provide you with some clarity on the sanctuary designation process, what this is not. We know this is of great interest to the Mid-Atlantic Council. What we'll do today is I will spend some time talking about the sanctuary designation process, then turn it over to LeAnn, who will talk specifically about the Hudson Canyon proposal. And then we will certainly leave time for any questions that you have, and we'll do our best to try to answer them.
We have to see next slide because this is not
working. Okay, next slide, please. So a little bit about Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, and I do want to recognize our colleagues, Mike Pantney and John Hare. It's nice to see both of you today. We are part of the National Ocean Service, one of 6 line offices within NOAA. The National Marine Sanctuary Program is in its 50th year of existence this year. We are part of the larger National Marine Sanctuary System. Next slide, please. Look, back one.
It's working now.
Okay, that you can see there on the map. What I like to point out about this map is the geographic diversity of the National Marine Sanctuary System. National Marine Sanctuaries exist from far western Pacific with Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument across to California, the West Coast, and into the Gulf of Mexico. And where you see the yellow square, which means a proposal in designation, the Hudson Canyon proposal off of New York. The sanctuaries represent a great diversity of habitats, of ecosystems, of community demographics, and we manage the system for those purposes to provide for the long-term conservation of these nationally significant resources and community engagement. Next slide, please. So taken directly from our legislation, which is the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, we have these series of management objectives. We work to conserve for future generations the ocean and Great Lakes areas of special national significance. We work to strike a balance between the protection of these resources and sustainable use. We work to employ innovative, transparent, and community-based problem solving with a focus on non-regulatory solutions, although we are a regulatory part of NOAA. We work to customize management actions to meet the needs and features of individual sanctuaries. One size does not fit all. We work to enhance our efforts through a diverse array of partnerships. We cannot do what we do without partnerships, and we have a wide array of different partners that we work with. And of course, we rely, like all of NOAA, on using the best available science in our decision making. Next slide. Oh, you're right here, sorry.
Right.
Okay, so we have a toolkit of management actions that we use across all of our sanctuaries. These are the types of things that you will see across all of those sanctuaries that you saw on the map. We have very strong research and monitoring programs, and we have a very strong reliance on outreach and engagement. Our outreach and engagement programs are known, I think, around the NOAA community and around the Marine Protected Area community as being some of the more advanced in that realm. We do focus on maritime history and heritage. We employ large cadres of volunteers to assist us with the work that we do. As I mentioned, we implement both regulatory and non-regulatory programs. We rely heavily on and lean greatly on sanctuary advisory councils, which are just as they sound. They are advisory bodies that provide recommendations to our sanctuary superintendents on the management actions that we take and evolve through our management plan review processes and other pathways. As I mentioned, we also promote healthy recreation and tourism across all of our sanctuaries. I mentioned we rely on partnerships, and last but not least, we believe strongly in tribal and indigenous community engagement. So a little bit more about sanctuary advisory councils. These are bodies made up of diverse array of community representatives whose role is to provide advice and recommendations to NOAA, typically through the sanctuary superintendent. As you see from this slide, this is not a hard and fast template of the seats that you get on all National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Councils, but this is pretty close. It's pretty representative of the types of bodies, organization, interest, stakeholders that make up our advisory councils. They provide a very strong connection to our communities and are, really, we rely on them for their advice, for their input, for their thoughts in representing these different constituencies in terms of how we evolve our management, how we adapt our management, and how we ultimately engage with our communities. We will talk a little bit more about a proposed Sanctuary Advisory Council in the pre-designation for Hudson Canyon as well here. LeAnn will talk a little bit about that. I want to just quickly mention that there are significant differences between marine national monuments and national marine sanctuaries. The primary difference really is that they are designated under very distinct authorities. Monuments, as I'm sure all of you know, are designated under the Antiquities Act, typically by presidential executive order. National marine sanctuaries are designated under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. They typically are done over a much longer period, 3 to 5 years is what we've seen for most designations. They are guided by National Marine Sanctuary designations, are guided primarily by the tenets of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. They typically take much longer because of the robust public process that is associated with sanctuary designation. But you will see both of these types of designations within the sanctuary system. We currently manage 2 marine national monuments in the Western Pacific, but they are designated under very different authorities with, for all intents and purposes, different intentions and different purposes over the long term. Now, this next slide, I apologize, is a bit wonky, but it's very important and fundamental to the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council and all fishery management councils. And this is what, I wish we had a better name for it, but this is what we lovingly call Section 304A5 of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. And what Section 304A5 requires us to do is to consult with the respective fishery management council anytime we are designating a new national marine sanctuary or anytime we are contemplating any fishing regulations. In the case of Hudson Canyon, the 304A5 process is the opportunity for the Mid-Atlantic Council to provide us with their thoughts on the need, if there is a need, for any fishing regulations that might be a part of this sanctuary designation. The fact that we implement 304A5, that we are required to consult, does not automatically imply that we are considering or contemplating fishing regulations for this sanctuary, but it is a requirement under statute for us to consult with you so that the council can provide its expert recommendations to us as to whether or not they feel any additional fishing regulations are warranted. Under 304A5, the councils and National Marine Fisheries Service can basically take three actions. The first is the council can recommend to us that some new draft fishing regulations are warranted. The council can recommend that no new fishing regulations are warranted, are not necessary as part of the sanctuary designation's goals and objectives because of perhaps the actions that are currently taken by the council and by the fisheries service, or the council can choose to not act on the matter at all. So I'm sure, as most of you know, we did send letters to begin the 304A5 consultation process to the New England, South Atlantic, and Mid-Atlantic councils, as well as the HMS Division, Atlantic HMS Division of the Fisheries Service in early July to begin this process. We wanted to do it as early as we could so that we could get your input and your thoughts on whether you felt any additional fishing regulations were needed as we began to develop the DEIS for the Hudson Canyon proposal. We had originally requested sometime around the end of December response, but all three councils requested an extension, which was then granted for February 1st. Last comment I'll make on this is whatever recommendations that you provide to us that Chairman Luisi mentioned just a few minutes ago, we will incorporate that into the DEIS. That is what we really want from you all, is the ability to have your input and your opinions so we can get it into that DEIS for further public review and to support our own analysis as we draft that DEIS. So just a couple more notes on that DEIS and the documents that go along with the sanctuary designation. First, we begin with the public scoping process. Back in early summer or midsummer, we began the original proposal to start scoping for Hudson Canyon. And that's really what it was, just an open proposal to get general comments and ideas on the concept of a sanctuary in the Hudson Canyon area. LeAnn will talk a little bit more about the nomination we received to start this process, but we began scoping in the early summer, and that scoping period closed on August 8th of this year. This again was the very first phase of the process. We are now in the stage or the phase of collating all of the comments we received. We are analyzing those comments as a means of beginning to piece together the DEIS and the draft management plan, as well as a proposed rule. And those are the three fundamental documents that we are required to produce anytime we propose a new designation. Again, a DEIS under NEPA, a draft management plan, which will capture the majority of our non-regulatory actions, and then a proposed rulemaking. This will involve multiple opportunities and multiple pathways for intergovernmental and stakeholder consultation. And as I mentioned, this whole package, DEIS, management plan, and proposed rule, will go out again in, I would estimate, at least a year and a half to 2 years' time for public review. One other piece I really want to mention on this for all of your awareness, under this second set of bullets where we are developing our draft documents, is something called the Sanctuary Terms of Designation. What the Sanctuary Terms of Designation do is three primary things. First, they will characterize the assets of the sanctuary being proposed, in this case Hudson Canyon, that qualify it for what we feel National Marine Sanctuary status. So it will provide a description of those nationally significant assets that are part of the Hudson Canyon proposal. The second thing it will do is it will highlight and describe the boundaries, the proposed boundaries that we are putting back out for public review. And then third, and most important for this group, is it will also describe and delineate the activities that are subject to regulation. Anything that we propose to regulate must be included in the terms of designation. If the terms of designation do not consider or contemplate or identify any particular activity, we do not have the authority to regulate that activity. So in the case of fishing, if fishing is not identified in the terms of regulation, the terms of designation, as an activity subject to regulation, we do not have the authority to regulate fishing under the Sanctuaries Act. So I just want to make sure that that wonky sort of side of the policy part of our responsibilities under drafting these documents is clear for everyone. Finally, we will put an environmental impact statement and management plan together. We will release that to the public, not for an additional review, but as the first and final step in the designation process. The National Marine Sanctuaries Act requires 45 days of continuous congressional session to review the final proposal. That means Congress reviews, not individual congressmen or women. The Congress will have the opportunity to review it for 45 days of continuous session, which can often mean several months. But once that 45 days of continuous congressional session is over, we publish the final rule and a record of decision, and the sanctuary is designated. That typically takes, as you see at the top of the slide, 3 to 5 years to do. In recent designations, we have not come in on the 3-year mark. We have come in always closer to the 5-year mark. So I would expect something similar for this Hudson Canyon proposal, should it continue to go forward. All right, that was a lot. So we will try to, again, answer questions on this after LeAnn's portion of the presentation, but I'll turn it over to her now to talk a little bit more about Hudson Canyon itself.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to see some familiar faces. Before coming to Sanctuaries, I spent 13 years at NOAA Fisheries. So it's wonderful to see some of you that I worked with at NOAA Fisheries when I was there. So now that you're oriented to the Sanctuaries program as a whole, I'm going to talk specifically about Hudson Canyon. We received the nomination in 2016 from the Wildlife Conservation Society. And excuse me, we, after reviewing the nomination against our series of significance criteria and management considerations, we placed it on the inventory in 2017. And then in February of 2022, we did a 5-year review. So nominations stay on the inventory. They are reviewed every 5 years to ensure that they are still relevant, that they still meet our criteria. So we did that in February of 2022 and decided to maintain the nomination on the inventory. A few things about the WCS nomination. Several goals of WCSs for this proposed designation: to support the long-term conservation of marine wildlife and habitats, to highlight and support sustainable economic uses of Hudson Canyon, including fishing. And let me just note that the nomination was very clear that fisheries in the Hudson Canyon area are well managed by the councils and NOAA Fisheries, and that they should continue to be managed under those authorities. They mentioned precluding uses such as oil, gas, and mineral extraction, expanding ocean education, outreach, monitoring and research programs in the area, and finally, bringing together diverse organizations and providing a framework for local and regional partnerships. Okay, so as Matt mentioned, in the first step of this process for the scoping phase, in the notice of intent, we did not go out with any boundaries. Instead, we highlighted the area. We truly wanted to start from a very neutral position with this proposed designation. Our goal was to get input from the public on boundaries. And so just a couple of things about the area. I'm sure you all know it's about 100 miles southeast of New York City. It is the largest submarine canyon along the Atlantic coast. Because of the diverse sediments and flux of nutrients, it is an ecological hotspot for an abundance of marine life. It includes nationally significant natural resources, including threatened, endangered, and protected species. And the robust biodiversity of the canyon directly supports the local economy and is an important area for both recreational and commercial fisheries. There are indigenous communities in the area that have maintained strong cultural practices tied to the ocean and coastal waters in this region. So in the notice of intent, we put together goals for the designation, and the proposed sanctuary is based on Hudson Canyon's diverse qualities and is guided by the purposes and the policies of the Sanctuaries Act, many of which Matt mentioned. So we have identified 5 overarching goals to support the long-term conservation of the area's marine wildlife, habitats, maritime cultural resources, to highlight and promote sustainable uses of the area. One thing I want to reiterate, especially to this group, is that fishing occurs across the vast majority of the sanctuary system, and we have always seen well-managed fisheries as an important part of a healthy national marine sanctuary. We want to work to identify and raise awareness of the indigenous connections to the area, also to expand ocean science and monitoring in and education and awareness of the area. And finally, to provide a platform for collaborative and diverse partnerships. Basically, to sum it up, we want to shine a bright light on Hudson Canyon, to bring awareness to the specialness of the place and to bring this place to a lot of people that don't know that it exists. That's one of our strengths, as Matt mentioned, in the sanctuaries program, connecting communities through outreach and education. Okay, so as I mentioned, the public scoping process, the comment period closed in August. We held virtual and in-person meetings, and we received over 15,000 comments. Some of those that you see there generally support for the proposed designation, overwhelming support for a pre-designation Sanctuary Advisory Council. We did receive opposition in general to MPAs and some with confusion around the differences between marine monuments and sanctuaries. We received great recommendations for boundaries and ideas for research and monitoring related to climate for the area. We also received recommendations for activities that should be prohibited in the sanctuary, such as oil and gas drilling, mineral extraction, ideas for enhanced education and outreach, and some suggestions for compatibility with offshore energy development, such as offshore wind. So next steps. Publishing this morning is the Federal Register notice that establishes the Hudson Canyon Sanctuary Advisory Council. And this also is soliciting applications for our voting seats. There will be 15 voting seats. These are non-government seats, and there will be 15 alternates. So there you see in that second bullet, diverse range of stakeholders for those 15 seats. I just want to mention we are proposing to have 2 from the recreational fishing community and 2 from the commercial fishing community, in addition to the others listed there. We also are on the Sanctuary Advisory Council have non-voting governmental seats, and we have invited the state and federal agencies that you see listed there, including the Mid-Atlantic Council. And so voting seat applications are due from the public actually on January 31st. That says late January, early February. It will be January 31st. And so then we will collect the applications that were received for the voting seats. We will review those applications, select the members. It will probably be March or April before we convene our first Sanctuary Advisory Council meeting. And really the goal of the Sanctuary Advisory Council is to help guide and provide recommendations to us as we move through the designation. And then finally, as Matt mentioned, we are beginning to draft the DEIS, the proposed rule and draft management plan. And we estimate that will be a year and a half before that is released. All right, so that is what I have for specific Hudson Canyon information. The website is there at the top. All of the Sanctuary Advisory Council information that is including the notice that is published in the Federal Register today, the charter for the Advisory Council, the applications, the information, that will all be posted to the website. So if you have any additional questions after the discussion, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. And that's it. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thank you, LeAnn, for your presentations. Let's see if members of the council have any questions for you regarding your presentation. Excuse me. Pat Gear.
Thank you very much. LeAnn, I just have a quick question. I've sat on the Grays Reef Sanctuary Council in the past. Is there a superintendent in place already? I mean, it seems you would be creating the council. I mean, who's going to be? I'm wondering about the administration of that.
There is no superintendent, and in the sanctuaries program, in the last few designations, we have used a pre-designation sanctuary advisory council, and typically the project lead for the designation serves as the lead for the advisory council. There is usually also a coordinator, and in this instance, I will be coordinating the Sanctuary Advisory Council in addition to my colleague Ellen Brody, and she's actually leading the designation for the Lake Ontario National Marine Sanctuary. So her and I will co-lead the Advisory Council, but it's a good question because there is no superintendent yet. Yeah.
What she's saying is that the council will provide recommendations to her. As the NOAA representative. And I just wanted to add, because it's a very good question, is we cannot have a superintendent in place at the moment because for federal workforce management rules, there's no organizational unit yet to assign that superintendent to.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Good question, Pat. I've got Matt Cayley, U.S. Coast Guard.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I had a quick question for you on the Hudson Canyon location there. Do you see that being used for tourism or recreational diving, similar to some of the other sanctuaries? And the reason I ask is because that area, in addition to the commercial and recreational fisheries that exist out there, it's also a pretty big artery for the port of New York City there with vessels coming in and out. So it's a concern that we've had when we have these sanctuary proposals that, depending on where the location is, that there's potential for multiple factions of folks to be in that area that cause a safety concern, especially with this one being so far offshore. Our resources are limited out there. So just curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't know of a whole lot of recreational diving that occurs in the area. It's mostly, obviously, recreational fishing, commercial fishing. There is some whale watching in the area, not very much, and also some seabird recreational tourism, but limited. Yeah, and we have been working with the Coast Guard on their traffic separation scheme in the area. They had the proposed rule, and so we are working with them as well, just to make sure that we understand what they have proposed in the area, because we know that it is a very busy area. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Matt, do you want to add anything?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, it's a great question that one of the tools that we rely on for the idea of bringing this place to sort of the greater New York metropolitan area, I think in this circumstance will be less about people getting in the water and diving, but will be on outreach technology, the use of remotely operated vehicles, for example, to live stream information or video, perhaps, back through the New York Aquarium or something like that. But right now, we have not seen, at least in the proposal, as LeAnn said, a ton of, folks promoting the idea of actively diving or being on the water, other than for whale watching and bird watching, more surface type activities. I think that's what we're seeing now.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, I have Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know why you would ever get out of a perfectly good boat 120 miles offshore, but that's to each his own, I suppose. So my mic's here. So my question is about how you weigh comments. I mean, in your presentation, you showed there was 15,000 comments. So you have two councils, New England and the Mid-Atlantic, that represent every state from North Carolina to Maine. That's only going to be two comments. But the pyramid of stakeholders in those two organizations is pretty substantial. So how do you weigh two comments from the councils versus, let's just pick numbers, 14,998 form letters? So how does that weigh into the process? Thank you.
It's a good question. I will say just as a baseline for information, you are right. We did receive a lot of form letters. So once we took those form letters away, we received about 400 individual comments. We take all of those comments equally and consider all of those, just as we do the WCS nomination. That is now part of the public input. That does not get any more weight in what we're doing now, that it is now a federal action, it is now a NOAA proposal. And so we will consider all of those. But I would also say through the Sanctuary Advisory Council with the Mid-Atlantic, the New England, NOAA Fisheries, and that participation, I think that body will help with comments and help guide us in what we do. Yeah. I hope that answered.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, you're fine, no problem. So just to clarify, and you did mention in your presentation, 304A5 says councils can recommend draft fishing regulations, recommend that fishing regulations are not necessary. It doesn't say that any new or additional regulation is necessary. So how does existing regulations, which there are more than a few in Hudson Canyon, it doesn't fit into the language of 304A5?
A good question. Before I answer that, Eric, too, let me say that we do not weigh the public comments based on the numbers that we received. We, as LeAnn implied, we bin them by substance. So the 400 out of the 15,000 represent unique comments that, as she said, we review equally, but we've never approached it from, if there's 10,000 comments versus one, those 10,000 weigh more than the other. It's really about the substance of the comments that we received and how we bin them. To answer your second question, yes, the idea is that we are looking to the councils for your input on whether any new recommendations are warranted, right? And I understand what you're saying, that that's not part of the language, but what we are contemplating and what we have included in our letter to you is what the Wildlife Conservation Society said, which is the existing regulations, management actions that are in place from both councils are doing a job that supports the existing goals and objectives that have been proposed. So the question at hand really for you is, are new regulations warranted on top of what you're already doing?
Okay, thank you.
It's an important distinction, right?
Yeah.
Sure. Is there anyone else from the council that has any questions at this time? Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both LeAnn and Matt for the presentation. How often do you all at the sanctuaries, review the existing fishing regulations and make a determination as to whether or not they're actually supporting, the intended goal and purpose of a particular sanctuary?
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. We are required by the National Marine Sanctuaries Act to review our management plans at every sanctuary every 5 years. So that's the requirement. But I think, as you can appreciate, our ability to do that every 5 years is conditioned by and driven by our, things like our resource availability, our staffing availability. We like to shoot for being as close to that as we can, but I'll be honest, it's challenging to try to do that across all national marine sanctuaries every 5 years. That's the trigger. But that process, the management plan review process, is the place where we take a formal approach to reviewing the management regime that is in place for any national marine sanctuary. So the answer to your question is the management plan review process would be the time we would review any and everything related to the management of a national marine sanctuary, which could include the fishing regulations. Again, we are required to do that every 5 years. We strive to do that. It's not often that we can meet that threshold. It's probably closer to every 10 years. But that would be the process by which we would contemplate that. And again, I have to remind everyone that if, in this case, fishing is not part of the activities that are subject to regulation in the terms of designation, the management plan review process in and of itself would still not allow us to change that. We would have to go through a change to the terms of designation, which is basically the same process by which we originally designated, which means we would have to go back to you all through the formal 304A5 process. That is just to change the term of designation. And that can be fishing or any other thing that's not already in those terms of designations. So the point is that for any regulatory action that we want to change, and we need to change the terms of designation, we would need to go through this process all over again.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Anyone else from the council before I turn things over to the public? John here.
Yeah, thank you. Just for a point of clarification, how many times have you gone through and done the process that you just talked about in the sanctuaries program, gone through and redone a sanctuaries designation?
Like how many times have we modified the terms of designation to include?
To include anything.
To include other activities.
I can't tell you exactly how many times, John, but I can tell you it's infrequent.
Yeah, thank you.
I will say too, though, that every time that there has been a designation, right? So this is there was a long hiatus on designations in the National Marine Sanctuary System. Most recently now, this is the fourth, I think, fifth maybe, that has happened over the last 5-10 years. Anytime that we do the designation, close a new designation, we have to go through this process. There's no option to do, say, just an EA. We have to do an EIS. We have to create a new management plan. We have to draft a proposed rule, and we have to go through 304A5.
Okay, thank you. Eric, follow up?
Yeah, I got one more question. Sorry. When it comes to economics of the fishery, do you plan to take into account the shoreside multiplier for the value of commercial fisheries that happen in that area, which is, in some cases, it's 6, 7, 8 to 1 X vessel.
X vessel revenue.
Yeah, X vessel times 8.
Yeah.
Or 6 or 5. It's a big number.
Yeah, so we have economist on staff, and she's working with NOAA Fisheries, Garfo, getting information, getting data. That will all, in addition to Atlantic HMS, and so that information will be included in the DEIS. So yes, we will. We just actually talked about that a couple weeks ago in terms of economic data that we are gathering. Yeah, so yeah, and we will have our fisheries colleagues review that as well. Yep, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Dan Farnham.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. Throughout the whole range of the sanctuary system, how often is fishing included in the terms of designation and regulated through the sanctuary program?
I can't tell you exactly how many of our sites have fishing identified in the terms of designation. Again, it's a limited number. Right now, I know that to your second question, fishing is managed under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act in the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, I know there are others. I'm not going to speculate right now. I can certainly get back to you with a definitive answer on that. I will say in the case of Channel Islands, it's in a series of discrete areas known as marine reserves that are regulated in conjunction with, under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, with the National Marine Fisheries Service. The regulations coexist together within these marine reserves. And that was a process that was originally contemplated and ultimately executed under this 30485 process. But if you would like the exact numbers on that, I'm more than happy to get that to you. I think at this moment, say that the number of our units with fishing in the terms of designation is small.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. I actually, I think it would be useful to know that if you wouldn't mind. Very good. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and so Matt and LeAnn, if you, when you find that and when you get that information, you can send it to Dr. Moore, and he can distribute it to the rest of the council. Be great.
We will do that, yep.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I have a few hands from the public online. Anyone else from the council before I go off to the public for questions? Is there anyone in the room that would like to make comment? I see one hand. Greg, I'll come back to you in just a second. Let me go to the webinar. I have James Fletcher. James? It looks like you're unmuted on your end, James. We can't hear you though. Okay, let's do this, James. We're not able to hear you if you're speaking. So why don't we come back to you? We'll see if we can figure that out. Hopefully it's not a webinar problem. I'm going to go next to Julie Evans, and then Greg, I'll come to you from the audience. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering, how far back does the data go for the for-hire industry and the commercial fishing industry in the Hudson Canyon? I remember fishing there myself many years ago. It was a great place to catch yellowfin tuna back in the day. And how recent is the data that will be used to decide in the EIS? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. We're looking at 10 years, going back 10 years in the data. And we will be using obviously current information, so, yep.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Greg DiDomenico?
Morning. Thank you. Greg DiDomenico, Lunds Fisheries. Just a quick, if I could expand, or they could expand a little bit on the terms of, what would you call it? Terms of designation. So currently, if this was all complete tomorrow and you had a Sanctuary Advisory Council in place, you could not manage commercial fishing under the guise of uses or activities to say that bottom tending mobile gear is incompatible with the sanctuary. Right now, you cannot do that. Is that correct?
So let me see if I understand your question. So right now, we cannot do anything in Hudson Canyon. We have no authority in Hudson Canyon. There is no National Marine Sanctuary. So if it were designated today, the only way that we could have any authority over any gear type, any fishery in Hudson Canyon is if, first and foremost, fishing is identified in terms of designation as an activity subject to regulation. And second, if in consultation under 304A5 with Mid-Atlantic Council, New England Council, the regulations were proposed to us, accepted, drafted, they all made sense relative to the goals and objectives. Those two pieces would be instrumental, the first being required for us to be able to do what you said. Now, under 304A5, there is a provision that says if the councils take that third option and choose not to do anything, then the Secretary of Commerce, delegated to the NOAA administrator, could decide that the sanctuary could regulate a fishy, a gear type or whatever under the Sanctuaries Act. That's a rare occurrence, but that's also part of 304A5, which is why we feel it's always the best option that the councils provide us with either that recommendation to say, here's what those regulations should look like, or we don't believe they're warranted because of the existing management measures that we already have in place. I hope that helps.
It does. And hate to throw you a hypothetical, but in 5 years, under a Sanctuary Advisory Council review, that could change. Sanctuary Advisory Council could do that on their own in their update and review and change the terms of designation.
No, that is not correct.
Okay?
So what the Sanctuary Advisory Council could do is recommend that the sanctuary contemplate a fisheries management action, whatever that might be. It would be then our responsibility, our requirement under the Sanctuaries Act to then go back out and propose a change to the terms of designation. If this designation does not include fishing in its terms of designation. The National Marine Sanctuary Act stipulates that anytime we change the terms of designation, we have to go back out under the same process by which we originally designated, which means we are proposing a change to the terms of designation, proposing a new regulation, going through the 304A5 process to get the council's recommendations on that, going out twice for public review, and then ultimately making a decision on whether or not that can happen. So the council does not have, the advisory council, Sanctuary Advisory Council, as opposed to the Mid-Atlantic Council, does not have the authority to change any of our regulations.
Two more on that thread. Will windmills come under the same authority or process?
Yes. So wind energy right now is something that is in its own unique space. Not to be too obvious. But the issue with wind right now, so for us to regulate a wind energy project in a national marine sanctuary, that's not something that occurs because it is not something that is explicitly regulated under regulatory language in any national marine sanctuary. In other words, there's no national marine sanctuary that says a wind turbine is not allowed in a national marine sanctuary. Typically, the way that any wind turbine or anything similar to a wind turbine would be subject to regulation is via other regulations, which are things like there is prohibitions on alteration of the seafloor, for example, in many sanctuaries. So anchoring stuff to the seafloor. There is typically prohibitions on discharge. So if you're discharging, that's a violation of the regulations. But there is no explicit prohibition on wind. Right now, we are engaged in a very detailed debate, negotiation with BOEM on the authorities of who can permit, authorize, or otherwise allow or prohibit wind proposals in national marine sanctuaries. It's not clear at this point where those negotiations are going to end up, but it is BOEM's belief that they have the sole authority for permitting wind projects and that they don't have authority inside a national marine sanctuary. So this is going to be something that is going to evolve, certainly during the process of this designation. But if you're looking for, or if you're implying a direct prohibition on a wind farm in a sanctuary, that would somehow have to be identified in the terms of designation.
And last, oh, sorry. But last, I promise. Under your existing authority, can you do marine reserves inside of your sanctuary boundary in discrete areas?
It depends on what you want to do with the marine reserve. So we can designate a marine reserve inside a national marine sanctuary, but then the question is under what management actions? So all the same rationale applies to a marine reserve inside a national marine sanctuary if it's delineated and executed under the Sanctuaries Act. If a regulation on fishing is to occur inside that marine reserve, which is typically what you have them for, the only way we can do that under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act is if fishing is identified as an activity subject to regulation in the terms of designation.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you for that, Greg, and thank you for those answers. I'm going to take one last question from the audience, and we're going to come back to the council for a decision on a recommendation. Let's go next. We are on the webinar. We have Mike Wayne. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the sanctuary staff. This has been a really helpful session to learn more about this process, and you guys have articulated well kind of what that looks like. I'm just wondering, are there materials that outline some of the answers to the questions that have been asked this morning? Are those available either on the sanctuary website, or could they be available? Because I think we're going to get a lot of similar questions from stakeholders on this process, because it's not something that we deal with regularly at the council level. And so I think those types of resources would be really valuable. And then, so that's my first question. The second question is there information on the you said commercial and rec are getting 2 seats each. There's other categories there. Is the seat assignments per se in the Federal Register notice or online somewhere? So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
I'm just flipping the slides. So we just heard from our web. Actually, I just got an email a second ago. All of the Hudson Canyon Sanctuary Advisory Council information is now live on the website. So you can go to sanctuaries.noaa.gov/Hudson Canyon. That will give you access to the charter. And in the charter for the advisory council, you will see the breakdown of different seats for the voting members and then the non-voting governmental seats. So yes, that is in there. It is on the website as well. And I would also say, and Matt, please add, in terms of just basic general information on the things that we've been talking about, even the criteria that we look at when we're determining whether a nomination should be added to the inventory, that is all on the website. We do have a lot of information about the program, about the nomination process, about the designation process. So I would say that is a really good starting point to go to the website. And if you feel that after you've reviewed the website and looked, if you still have questions and need information, please reach out to me and I can provide you with more targeted and specific information that you're looking for.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank the gentleman who just raised the comment over the webinar. We do greatly appreciate his and all of your attention as we walk through this pretty wonky stuff. And I agree that, there's a lot of moving parts here that are not, sort of part of the common conversation. So we really appreciate the opportunity to at least try to explain some of this. For the gentleman on the phone, if there's anything in particular that he would like regarding these various processes we've talked to, we can certainly send anything out to him or anybody else. In addition to what LeAnn mentioned, I would certainly suggest the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. It's a relatively easy piece of legislation to read. All of this 304A5 part is in there. That is a part of the Sanctuaries Act. There are other things that we have that maybe can help to his question, explain some of what we've just been talking about. And if I could, Chairman Luisi, one last thing to Mr. DiDomenico's questions. I just wanted to clarify too that the terms of designation as they relate to fishing they contemplate regulations under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, right? So existing fishery management actions, especially under Magnuson or state authorities, can and should still occur under those authorities per those processes. When we talk about regulating fishing under 304A5, and when we talk about the terms of designation, the distinction there is regulating under the Sanctuaries Act. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
I appreciate that. Mike, do you have a quick follow-up? I really do want to get back.
Yeah,
bumping
yeah,
up
just
against our time
super,
limits here.
super quick. If there's the opportunity for sanctuaries to have like frequently asked questions specific to fishing regulations within the sanctuary, I think that would be really valuable for stakeholders. Something that we could point our membership towards to help them understand what exactly will this mean, what will the process look like for all the things you discussed this morning relative specifically to fishing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the sanctuary staff.
We do have those, and more than happy to get them out to Mike. However, we want to get those out. We do have FAQs related to fishing and sanctuaries.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to bring this back to the council, and as mentioned in the presentation, we have the opportunity to provide a recommendation. There are three choices that we can make at this time. The first one is recommend draft fishing regulations for the proposed sanctuary. We could recommend that fishing regulations are not necessary, or, choose not to act on the matter. So I'm going to bring it back to the council at this time to see if anyone is willing or would like to make a motion regarding a recommendation. Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. So my preference is for the second avenue here. My only concern is I just don't want that to conflict with any of our existing fishery management plans that we have. So is there a way to offer that advice that says we don't want anything that's sanctuary specific as a function of the sanctuary designation process, and none of that would supersede what we do on a species fishery management plan specific basis? Is that an appropriate way forward?
Yeah, I believe that's the case, and Matt and LeAnn are both nodding. So Adam, if you're willing, I'd accept that recommendation through a motion.
So I would move that we recommend to the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries that additional fishing regulations are not necessary to implement the proposed sanctuary designation.
Okay, thank you for that motion. Adam, is there a second for that motion? Scott Lennox is going to second that motion. Adam, did you want to provide rationale, or is it pretty straightforward and clear at this point?
I'm comfortable that the discussion here today and the description of what that action means justifies the need for this motion here today.
Scott, did you want to add anything?
Adams, this is pretty straightforward. And I'd just like to add that my name's only got one N in it.
All right, thanks, Scott. Any discussion on the motion by members of the council? Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just suggest that you also include that after the proposed sanctuary designation that maintained authority under the Magnuson-Stevens Act through the council process, or the other way around probably, to manage commercial and recreational fisheries in the future.
No, I appreciate that, Eric. It's on the record, and I think it's clear. I'd rather maintain the motion as it stands, but no, it's on the record. I think it's been acknowledged, and it'll be clear At least it is in my mind, and hopefully for other members of the council. Is there any other discussion on the motion from members of the council? Okay, seeing none, very quickly, I will look to the audience here in the room. Is there anybody that would like to make a comment regarding the motion? Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Jeff Kalen, also from Lunds. And I really support the motion. I think it's the right direction. And I just wanted to point out in the application, I think there's some language in there that LeAnn spoke to about the fact that even the people who suggested the sanctuary believe that the fishing regulations are adequate in the area. So that's another part of the justification for the motion, I think. And thank you very much for this. And that's all I have to say.
Appreciate that. Adam Nowalski, we'll come back to the table.
Yeah, just one other comment I wanted to make is that the language of this motion relevant regarding to implement, this is not necessarily an endorsement of this council for the full implementation. This is simply saying that should that implementation take place, that no additional fishing regulations are necessary. Just wanted to make that clear at this point.
It's a good point, Adam. Thank you. And I got nods from the other side of the table on that one as well. All right, we're going to stay back to the table here. Is there any other discussion on the motion? Okay, seeing no hands in the room and seeing no council members' hands on the webinar, I'm going to see if we can do this the easy way. Is there any objection to this motion? Seeing nothing from the table and seeing nothing on the webinar, with no objection, this motion carries by unanimous consent. Jessica, is there anything else to come before us right now on this issue?
No, this was a great discussion, and if you're comfortable, we'll package up this recommendation along with some really excellent talking points and justification around the conversation that we've heard today, and get that letter submitted by February 1st to the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries.
Excellent. That would be great. LeAnn and Matt, thank you very much for your presentation this morning. Hopefully you got some good feedback, and this is, as I think it was Mike Wayne who mentioned that, this is something that we don't often deal with on a day-to-day basis. So it is a little complicated, but you guys did a great job of explaining it. And I hope that you'll take our recommendation seriously as it comes, as I'm sure you will. But thanks for being here today. So this concludes this item on today's agenda. It is a little after 10. We are going to move into the committee reports. Before we do, as I mentioned to you before we started, the bat phone is starting to light up. So I am going to just make one comment regarding committee issues. Wes is going to handle the rest of the afternoon, rest of the morning. I hope to be able to get home. I should be able to get home in time, and I will be back online as soon as possible to listen in and possibly weigh in on topics that are covered later this morning. The one thing I wanted to mention that's not on the agenda is that the executive committee met on Monday under closed session to discuss the Rick C. Savage Award. It was determined by the executive committee that the solicitation for nominations would be extended and that we would reconvene after Chris sends out another solicitation for nominations. We'd reconvene to discuss the Rick C. Savage Award at the February meeting. So that's the one report that I wanted to make that wasn't on the agenda. I think it would be safe at this time to give everybody a few minutes. Wes, are you okay with taking like a 10-minute break to people check out and stuff like that? And then, okay, so let's take a 10-minute break. And It's been great seeing all of you over the last few days. Please be safe getting home. The weather outside, if you haven't been outside yet, is pretty terrible. So just drive carefully, and hopefully you all have a wonderful holiday. And I will see you at the February meeting. So it's great seeing you all. Be careful, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. Let's come back at, let's give you a few extra, 10:20. Start up in 10:20. Thank you.
Merry Christmas, Mike.
Go Eagles.
Hey, Steven, can you check my audio?
You're good. Two-minute warning. We're going to come back at 10:20. Welcome back, everyone, to today's meeting. We're now going to do committee reports. Normally at this time we do the SSC report, but there is no report at this time. If you've noticed in the briefing book, the 2023 dates and anticipated topics were included. If nobody has any questions for Paul Rago or Brandon, I'm going to move on to the next topic. All right, seeing no questions, let's go to the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee. Dr. Michelle Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this will be quick, but we just thought it would be good to give a brief overview of the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Committee Joint Committee and AP meeting that was held a couple of weeks ago to discuss the comprehensive ecosystem approach to fisheries management risk assessment review. So the original risk assessment was completed back in 2017, and so that's been updated annually as part of the State of the Ecosystem reports that the Council receives in April of a year. And it's just, given the length of time that has occurred between when the risk assessment was finalized in 2017, we've had some council member turnover, committee members and AP members who were not around when this was first developed. We had sort of a kickoff meeting to develop our work plan over the next year for this review. So we had some presentations from both staff, council staff and Northeast Fisheries Science Center staff on sort of the origin of the risk assessment, how it came to be, and how it's been used. And so let's go to the next slide, Stephen. Thank you. So, after receiving those presentations, the committee focused its discussion on sort of three different things. What are some new or additional risk considerations that could be incorporated, new information and analyses that could be included into this review, and then some other broader considerations. So with respect to, new and additional risk considerations, the committee and AP, we currently have other ocean uses within the risk assessment, but the committee recommended a stronger focus on offshore wind, just given the scope and pace of that development, the addition of aquaculture, habitat alteration, given some of the Northeast fish habitat assessment update that occurred, adding invasive species to this, and also looking at highly migratory species and interactions and food web dynamics. So, and then with respect to some of the updated information, we have habitat vulnerability analyses that can be incorporated into this. The Science Center has been working on these ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles for a number of species. I think bluefish and Atlantic mackerel included in there. So these contain stock-specific information that could be incorporated into this review. And then, of course, there is ongoing research with respect to offshore wind and the impacts that it might have on our managed species. So, and then just with respect to other considerations, we talked about really trying to decompose the risk into both short-term and long-term, and identifying what those short and long-term trends were, and then to incorporate into this a discussion of the timing and frequency of future updates to make sure that they're meeting the council's needs. Next slide, please. So then we moved into continued and future applications. Obviously very strong support for continuing to identify priorities through the framework and implement our structured decision-making framework through this, and to continue to have receive our annual updates. And in the lower right-hand corner there, you see sort of the report card for the different risk assessment elements as they currently are today, and to use this information to inform research priorities. And then with respect to incorporating this information into other council products, we talked about inclusion of this into our fishery information documents so that the advisory panels could discuss this and provide their input through fishery performance reports. And, I'll just note that Brandon and Dr. Sarah Gagis and Dr. Garrett DePiper, who were the Science Center staff who provided the overview reports, we were all at the council member ongoing development workshop, which there's some info behind Dr. Moore's tab on that, as well as Peter Hughes and Skip Feller. We were all at this workshop. So I think that was one of the things that other councils were doing, was they were including this ecosystem information in their fishery information documents. So that's something we're interested in. And then finally, we talked about integrating this with, other products and activities. So the ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles, that we mentioned, and then also incorporating this through the SSC's ecosystem work group analysis. Next slide, please. And then we just chatted about the timeline and review. So this sort of outlines our plan for the work that the committee and AP plan to do over the next year. So we decided to tackle this in 3 different parts, starting with a couple of virtual meetings, probably half-day meetings, joint meetings again between the advisory panel and the committee. The first one would consider all of our risk elements that we currently have, new risk elements that were mentioned and what those definitions would be, and then having a second meeting in the late spring to think about the indicators and the ranking criteria for those risk elements. And then we discussed the possibility of an in-person or hybrid meeting to just review all of the risk assessment components and application for the council's needs. And then this would all be presented to the council in the fall, if I'm recalling correctly. So, and then the one other thing that I'll note is, as we had discussed adding and modifying different risk elements, just making sure that we're not throwing in the whole kitchen sink and thinking about, prioritization just to keep, the scope and the number of elements manageable and informative to the council's work. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I have. And so I think, happy to take any questions. I think between Brandon and I and other committee members, we can answer anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Any questions? Michelle, I do not see any. Or we'll be expecting another update in February, or you're going to have a meeting probably April?
Maybe. I think probably, council staff and leadership will discuss when might be the most appropriate. We just wanted to, I think, our first meeting will probably be like late January, early February. I'm looking over to Brandon to see if he's got any input on that, but I think it'll probably be a couple meetings before we would provide an update. Thanks.
All righty. Thank you very much. Let's go to our next topic. Mackerel, Squid, Butterfish Committee. Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pulling them up on my screen right now. The Mackerel, Squid, and Butterfish Committee Advisory Panel and the committee held a joint meeting November 16th via webinar. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss potential follow-up regarding the disapproved ELEX permit amendment 22. During that meeting, we had great participation from the AP and from the committee members. We had, very good discussions and deliberations. And at that meeting, we passed 2 committee motions. And Stephen, I don't know if you have them. And the 2 committee motions, I move that the committee recommend the council request a more detailed explanation of the amendment rejection in terms of all 10 national standards and what National Marine Fisheries Service recommends for future amendment development. That was a motion that came out of committee. I think that there may be some discussion in regards to that motion here at the table today. So I will leave that to you, Mr. Chair, before I read the second motion. Thanks.
All right, let's see if we have any questions, comments on the first motion made by the committee. Stephen, can you just put the first motion up completely? Take away the second one.
Mr. Chair, I believe Jason, staff for the committee, is online. So he may wish to comment also.
Yeah, and I would kind of maybe kick it to the service to kind of see kind of their perspective on this. I think, the letter was also included, but they may have some comment on what additional perspective they may be able to provide.
Like,
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I guess on to the motion, I would look for some clarity as to exactly what more explanation the council would be interested in. You have our 4-page letter, which goes into, quite a bit of detail on the specific provisions of the Magnuson Act on which we based our disapproval. We didn't reject it on all 10 national standards, just on the ones that we cited and described in the letter. And then we do have a paragraph at the end that recommends, provides our recommendation should the council decide to reconsider the amendment. We offer some suggestions for an approach to move forward. And if this motion passes, I'll be abstaining on the motion, obviously, but if the motion passes, I guess we can take a look, but I don't know what else we can provide other than the 4-page letter that we've already provided.
Adam?
So if this were to pass, then one other thing that I would look for, Mr. Petney, you mentioned that you specifically referenced those national standards that you rejected this on the basis on. It might be helpful to this council if there was an inclusion of how what we did put forward might have been consistent with other national standards, so we can be sure to include those elements moving forward. So that's potentially one area of additional communication that I would find useful to me.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly do that. I suspect what it would look like is a rehashing of what the council put forward in the amendment when the council addresses, the 10 national standards for consistency. And if we find that, when we do a disapproval, we're looking to see if there's a national standard that we believe and take the position has been violated, and that's what we focus on. So I can certainly, do that, but I suspect it's going to look very similar to what the council provided.
Any other comments? Michelle DeVoe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support what Adam has put forward, and, I think it's clear that this, there are some strongly held opinions around this issue and the amendment, and I do think that, even if it does include something of a rehashing, that this would help to close the loop on some of those discussions.
Dewey?
Yeah, I would support what Adam was discussing to a more detailed rehashing of the explanation for the rejection of the national standards. Thank you.
Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So my personal opinion, I mean, I had something to say about the national standards, and I won't go through all 10. I don't want to take up anybody's time. But in the letter we got from Mr. Penny, there was no mention of 1 through 3 or 8 through 10, which is fine with me. But you did reference 4, 5, 6, and 7. In my mind, national standard 4, I mean, obviously there's no issue with the stock. Discards are up in that fishery, and whether that's due to new inexperienced participants, that's not for me to say, but perhaps there is some discussion there. National Standard 5, which addresses overfishing, overcrowding, and overcapitalization. Overfishing is not occurring. The stock is lightly exploited, but I think if you ask members of the fleet who actually do that fishery, overcrowding could easily be considered. There's also unintended consequences that early fisheries closures produce overcrowding in other fisheries. I mean, this year fishing was terrible, but all of a sudden you had a lot of big boats bumping, not bumping, but rubbing elbows with a lot of small boats under Long Island in a very small area trying to catch loligo. So there's an unintended consequence to the action. And as far as overcapitalization goes, in Mr. Didden's discussion, the capacity of the fleet in the last few years to catch the quota without any additional effort was catch 58,000 tons. You know, at the time we discussed this amendment, we were at 30 or 34,000 tons. I mean, the capacity to go to 58,000 certainly to me indicates overcapitalization. You know, but at the end of the day, if the determination is we're not going to go forward, well, then I would hope to God the SSC would recognize we're at 58,000 and that's our capacity and we should have 58,000. But that's another discussion. As far as National Standard 6 goes, which addresses flexibility, you know, there's a lot of boats that can operate in mixed trawl fisheries. There's usually smaller boats. You know, they have other permits and they can get by in a mixed trawl fisheries with, you know, 1,000 pounds of this and 500 pounds of that and 5,000 pounds of that. There are specialized boats built for the ELX fishery that cannot do that. So having early closures reduces the flexibility for that fleet, and I think that should be accounted for, or at least considered. And as far as National Standard 7, that addresses costs and wise use of the resource, reducing conflict. There is gear conflicts that goes on offshore, and there was one brand new vessel to the ELX fishery that towed up a bunch of trap gear, and that was a giant mess, and that's not the first time that that's happened. And like I said earlier, when the fishery closes, there is other conflicts in other fisheries, and certainly with more effort in what I would consider overcrowded conditions. Vessels have to spend more time at sea because, you know, you get a bunch of boats towing through a pile of ilex, so the fish disperse, and you got to spend more time at sea doing it. So that's what I would look to. Thank you.
Mike Petney, is your hand still up? The new comment?
Yeah, I'm just trying to reflect on some of the comments that we've heard and a couple of points. One, I haven't heard any specific questions that people don't understand in the letter that we could specifically address. I'm also not sure that I understand the council's intent behind this motion in terms of moving forward in the sense of if the council wants to reconsider an aspect of the LX amendment, it would be helpful to know that we could target our response focused on what might need to be done in order to make the council's, you know, to fulfill the council's intent. Simply rehashing our disapproval rationale or relitigating the basis for the amendment, I don't see how that's very productive. So it would be helpful if the council could consider refining this request to specifically get at the things that either people don't understand that were in our letter or that would be relevant to moving forward for some reconsideration of an aspect of the LX amendment.
Any more questions, comments from the table? Before we vote on this, any comments from the audience? Jeff Kalen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm on the AP, and I know I brought this up at the time. It didn't make it into the report, but one of the things that's really bothered us on Mike's decision is trying to understand the differences between the approval of the Loligo permit amendment and the disapproval of this amendment. And I think it would be very useful in terms of moving ahead to ask the agency about those differences between the approval of the one and the disapproval of the other. But that would help us in terms of moving ahead, I think. And I think we should move ahead because, the problem still exists in many of our minds. And so I wanted to throw that out because I think that comparison could be useful, perhaps. We had the egg mop issue. Maybe that's how we got to conservation. I remember that as being a secondary issue that came in after the permit rationalization occurred in ILX. And I think, we did ILX, we did Lalago first and then waited to do ILX. It might have had to do with the timing of the assessments. I can't remember. But anyway, I throw that out as one, some additional comparison that could be done between the approval of one and the disapproval of the other. So I just throw that out. I don't know if anybody else feels the same way, but thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Sam Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sam Martin, Fishing Vessel Enterprises. We own 70 ELEX permits. I just want to address a couple of things, and I'll reserve some comments for a little bit later, but there's a couple of issues brought up by Mr. Reed. There's crowding in a lot of different fisheries. A lot of crowding in the scallop fishery. There's crowding in the fluke fishery. It just depends on where the fish are on the edge, or in a slough, or in a different particular fishing area. There's a tremendous amount of crowding in other fisheries where we actually have collisions. So, that's to me not a reason to move forward on this amendment. Flexibility is another one. Everybody needs flexibility nowadays. We need to be able to flex to the permits that we've invested in. We have a downturn in the scallop industry. And in fact, that's where you're going to see increased participation because we tried to get an amendment through the New England Council when it came to reducing steel capacity. That didn't go through. So now we're increasing our capacity in other fisheries because we need to. We need to pay for our increased expenses that are happening, and that we need flexibility for. So I don't think lack of flexibility on someone else's part is a reason to put this amendment forward. Thank you.
Greg.
Sorry, Greg DiDomenico, Lund's Fisheries. I wanted to clarify a few things. I agree with Adam's request. There are some things that I think have been left out of the issues of whether or not this amendment and this action is contrary to national standards or not contrary to national standards. But I think more importantly is that the characterization by the agency, their opinion on whether or not, their opinion that says that we've run afoul of national standards. It's not that we don't understand it. We strenuously disagree with your opinion. That's the problem. And that's what needs to be discussed further. That's what needs to be further deliberated by this council, further explanation by the agency, because I will tell you that I think that not taking action ignores many of the problems associated with overcapitalized fisheries that we've all experienced. I think that's going to happen in this fishery with the additional vessels. And I think ignoring that is not prudent fisheries management. I will also say that the opinion of the agency and the rejection of this amendment, in my opinion, cheapens the investment, shoreside investment of many of the shoreside processors, including Lund's and Seafreeze. And I think that's very, very important. Lastly, I just end with, again, saying that this deserves further explanation. And again, it's not that we don't understand your letter, it's that we disagree with it. Thank you.
Katie.
Katie Almeida, the town doc. We don't see the need for further explanation on this. I'm on the AP, the Squid Mackerel Butterfish AP, and we had a final committee AP meeting in April of 2020 before there was a final decision made in June. And prior to that meeting, we all got a letter from NMSA stating their concerns and to the specific national standards. Being at that meeting and a part of the AP, none of that was really discussed, and it was just decided to basically move on in the direction we were going. So there was a warning, there was a heads up that there was a problem with his amendment, and that there might be a problem approving it if we didn't attend to the questions and the concerns of the service. So I just see this as, unnecessary. Any further action on the amendment in general and revisiting it, we are not we are not in favor for that. We have a species that has received, I believe this is the 3rd year of an increase. And we're working with people at the Science Center and Cooperative Research to do some more research on ILEX to hopefully we can get a larger quota again in the future. This is an already limited access fishery with a small number of vessels that participate in it. 76 permits, 54 active at this point right now. And again, we're seeing an increase in quota. I'll have to look into the increase of discards, because as far as I know, when we went through that and the amendment and we got all that information, it was a low discard fishery. It almost seems that every time we come and we have public comment on ILEX, and along the way, along the 4 years that we went through it, there was always another and new excuse or issue that comes to the table that we need to reduce effort in this fishery. Yesterday, we heard during the climate scenario planning portion, the need for flexibility. I attended that workshop in June, and when we discussed this, the word flexibility was coming up everywhere. Reducing effort and reducing permits in an already limited access fishery is not flexibility. We heard during yesterday's implementation plan that there are more pressing issues that we need to attend to, and that there's limited staff resources. And it's my opinion that we turn our attention and resources to that rather than looking to further reduce any type of effort in the ILEX fishery. And regarding this summer, yes, the ILEX, it was slow, but we also did see, we had a great longfin fishery, and we did see new people in the longfin fishery that hadn't prosecuted that fishery before that came from the ILEX fishery. And you're not seeing any complaints from us asking those people to remove from that fishery. It was great that they had the flexibility to move back and forth between the fisheries, and that's what we should be supporting for all of us to be able to survive. Thank you.
Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp, Seafreeze. I agree with the comments of both Jeff and Greg, and I do want to point out as far as rationale. Jeff discussed a little bit the difference between the agency's rationale in the Lalago Amendment versus the ELEX Amendment. The reason that ELEX was not included in the Lalago Amendment at the time that it was initiated, the rationale of the agency was that the fishery had not reached its quota. So there was no need to tier the permits, similar to what was going on in the Lalago fishery. Well, then shortly thereafter, the ELEX fishery closed early 5 years in a row, to the great detriment of historic participants. And so the rationale of the agency for not including ELEX in the permit tiers for Lalago at that time no longer exists. And I think also, eliciting more explanation from the agency to the different provisions of the ELEX amendment is justified in the sense of, one of the provisions was a vessel fish hold measurement. We already have that in mackerel. There's no reason why you couldn't have it in ELEX. It's another high tonnage fishery, primarily prosecuted by vessels with RSW tanks. It's the same exact thing. So I don't understand why it is appropriate for one fishery and not appropriate for another fishery. As to disagreeing with the agency's rationale, which, a lot of folks have mentioned, well, the ELEX amendment was only about economic allocation, which is not true. There is a safety aspect because ELEX is a high tonnage fishery designed to be prosecuted by high tonnage vessels with specialty equipment like RSW tanks. And right now, there are 2 new entrant vessels that entered the ELEX boom of the past few years that are now at the bottom of the ocean. They got into trouble. They were not built to go elexing. They had never done it before, and now they are at the bottom of the ocean. That is an issue. We also heard comments from folks saying that they intend to increase the capacity and send boats elexing. We already have a capacity issue. That's why the council initiated the action. And so what we're looking at is increased effort. During the time of the ELEX amendment, we had folks who were literally initiating amendments in the United States Congress to bring pollock boats from Alaska to the ELEX fishery on the east coast of the United States. That is inappropriate. And the amendment was designed to freeze the footprint of the fishery, which has been a consistent rationale of the Mid-Atlantic Council in many, many amendments. And I think that this does warrant further consideration. It does warrant further work. And as far as flexibility, you know, our 2 freezer boats, they elexed all summer long. They didn't go loligo fishing because they don't have the flexibility that other vessels do. And when the mixed fishery vessels switch between various fisheries, they are not reliant on the ELEX fishery the same that other vessels are. And so I would encourage the council to move forward with re-examining ELEX. Thank you.
Seeing no more audience hands. Dewey?
Yeah, I was wondering here, given the comments that we've heard both from Garfo and from the audience and members around the table, is there something more specific to this committee motion, given like specific questions of an explanation for Garfo to answer in the rejection of this ELEX amendment? It seems like this is a real broad thing that the council requests a more detailed explanation of the amendment rejections. It's like what parts of it, what different things, add in the different things we've heard from public comment here today at the table, throw that in there, or something aspect, because it seems like if it's not something more direct and specific, according to Garfo, it's going to get the same answer. And so I'm wondering if, and maybe that's the route the council goes, is we request a more detailed explanation. Garfo gives their explanation, and where do we go from there? So I was wondering if there's any possibility of something that, if there's going to be an AP meeting on this, that there's something specific written as to this that the council can give. It seems like this is a real broad type of asking for the council. That's just my thoughts.
The way I understand it is the staff and the committee will get together, form a letter, and then they'll bring it back to the council for our approval. So I guess they're going to, delve into the weeds a lot more, not in session per se. Adam, or Dewey, go ahead.
Yeah, well, then that's a better understanding of something specific to draw down to go on, not something broad. Thank you.
Adam?
So first off, while I appreciate the sentiment that was just suggested that there may be more committee and AP work to do to further develop this communication, I walked in here today as a committee member unaware that that was the plan. I felt pretty confident that this motion was the request, period. But if something changed since then, since I'm not aware of, I'd love to hear more about it. What I will say, though, is as a direct response to Dewey's question, and I'll offer my rationale for having voted in favor of this amendment initially, is the national standard 4 comments offered by the service referencing SSC evidence concluding the stock was lightly exploited with a small relative footprint to the fishery potential, I found that to be directly in conflict with what went on the water for the better part of almost 5 years. For 5 years, when you have quota overages, that suggests the fishery is exploited. That suggests that you are reaching the potential of that fishery. So what I would specifically be looking for is comments, what about that time period? How do you relate the comments that the fishery was lightly exploited without reaching its potential of the permit holders at the time when we were maxing out quota? How do we sync, and that may very well be the case given availability and where the fish are today. That may very well be the case. But we went through a period of time where it wasn't the case, in my opinion. We could go through that period of time again in the future. And should we come back to that point of time in the future, what would the service recommend we do in future amendment development to address the concerns of historic vessels that have less flexibility in the fishery than some of the newer participants?
Thank you, Adam. Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize for some of the confusion in terms of Wes's statements to the council. He misunderstood a conversation that we had. The way that this would work is if, in fact, this motion passes, staff will work to put together a letter to GARFO, basically with as much detail as possible based on the conversation that we've had today. And we can send it out to the council to look at before we actually send it to GARFO to make sure we didn't miss anything, which should be a relatively straightforward process after today's meeting.
I apologize for my confusion. Mike Petney?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of reactions. Adam, to your most recent point, I mean, the letter provides the SSC, your SSC's conclusion regarding the ILX stock, that the stock is lightly exploited and the fishery footprint is small relative to the potential of the fishery. I think we've seen evidence of that conclusion and the fact that we have significantly increased the quota over the last 4 years. Every year you've gone through the SSC. The SSC has recommended an increase in the ABC, which we have implemented as an in-season action to provide additional fishing opportunity. So you're asking me to explain the SSC's rationale? That's not exactly clear to me. We heard from Mr. DiDomenico that everybody understands the letter, but they disagree with it. I accept that. I didn't expect everyone to agree with the conclusion we reached. But I'm not sure what it serves. If everyone understands the letter, I'm not sure how it serves anyone moving forward for me to say the exact same things with more words. You all understand it, you understand it. You're not gonna change the outcome. We're not gonna relook at our letter because the council asked for more explanation and reach a different conclusion. So I'm just still struggling with understanding how the word of this motion helps us move forward. There were some specific questions which were relevant. I think there was a question about the fish hold provision. That's a relevant question. We didn't get into that specifically in our letter. There was a question about the comparison with the Lalago action. It's a fair point. We didn't address that in our letter. But simply asking for us to rehash and say in more words what we've already said, I don't see that as productive. Thanks.
Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, this has been a tough issue for me as a committee member, not having been around for the previous development of this amendment. I just want to thank all of the industry members who have reached out to me to communicate their concerns and their viewpoints. I think concerns on, both sides of this issue are valid. So I want to acknowledge and thank folks for that. Considering some of the comments that we've received and what Mike Pentney has just offered. I'm wondering if we can, wordsmith this a little bit to incorporate, I think a couple of those things that have been raised. So, Mr. Kalin raised the fact that it would be helpful to have a comparison of, I guess, perhaps the rationale for, approval of the Lalago amendment compared to the disapproval of this amendment, given the basis for each of those amendments, and that there might be different perceptions of what the basis for each of those amendments might be. Oh, and I just lost my other thought. That really sucks. But in any event, just trying to, offer some more specificity to this motion. Adam spoke about the comments with respect in the letter with respect to National Standard 4, which appear to consider just the quotas since 2018. And I'm wondering if there might be a little bit more detail that could be provided with respect to how the agency viewed the previous ILIX quota overages. In case it's not obvious, I'm trying to find some middle ground forward here. I think the concerns on both sides of this issue from industry are valid, the concern about flexibility, and the concern about future management of the fishery and what flexibility other components of the fishery might not have. And so I don't think I think we need to continue to have a conversation. This might be, one piece of information in the conversation. I'm hoping perhaps we can wordsmith this a little bit to provide more detail so that the agency can provide us and industry a more helpful response, as, Mr. Pentney has indicated. Thank you.
Adam?
Okay, so we're going to give that a try. Okay, and I'm going to move to substitute.
Hang on one second. Since this is a committee motion, I don't think we can just move to substitute it. We'd have to approve this one first, wouldn't we?
No, I believe now that it's a committee motion before us, it doesn't need a second, but I believe we as a body have the right to modify it. I'll defer to someone else, but I believe that's within our ability.
Okay.
Okay, so we're good? Okay.
My understanding is you can move to substitute.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, keeping me in line. I move that the council request a more detailed explanation of the amendment decision relative to all 10 national standards and the Lalago amendment, and what NMSA recommends for future amendment development on fish hold provisions, and consideration of historic participants with limited flexibility to pursue other fisheries. So let me make that as a motion to get us to the additional specificity we seem to be discussing here today.
We have a motion by Adam Nowalski. Do we have a second on the motion? Michelle Duval? A second? Make sure, who's doing the typing, Jason?
Yes, sorry for my poor and slow typing.
It's a lot faster than mine. Peter Hughes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say that there is a second motion, committee motion, that addresses the fish hold capacity. So I don't know how, without seeing that motion, I don't know how that would play into the request here with fish hold capacity. So, thanks.
Jason, do you have any feelings on tying the two together?
I mean, my guess is that regarding a general fish hold measurement and baseline limitation, the service will say that that may be possible if the council sufficiently explains how it meets the goals and objectives of the MSB FMP and the Magnuson Act. And I'm guessing they're not going to weigh in super heavy, whether, yes, this is a slam dunk, or no, it's a terrible idea. So, and if I'm wrong, the service can correct me. But just in terms of setting expectations, it's still, probably going to, be a situation where the council is going to have to work through an action development, develop the, again, this is assuming the council went down like a more narrow path here, a fish hold focus, going, integrating public comments, explaining how it aligns with everything, making the case, etc. I'm guessing we won't have perfect certainty, and the council will still be left with a decision to kind of pursue an action that has this these kind of some baggage and stated concerns that may not apply to a fish hold action, but there are going to be some relevant concerns. So I think the council, at least on the fish hold side of things, is still going to be left with a choice of a decision of moving forward with an action with, as always, an uncertain outcome and having to justify it appropriately.
Mike Petney, your hand's still up.
Thanks. I mean, Jason has it exactly right, probably because it's pretty much exactly what Emily said at the committee in response to this question. So, we'll put that in the letter so that everybody can read it. The consideration of historic participants with limited flexibility to pursue other fisheries, again, we're going to say something like, the council should develop measures that would, or that are consistent with the Magnuson Act and the national standards, and we'll stand by to provide assistance. Again, I still don't see how this helps move things forward. Again, it's asking for me to say in more words what we've already said. Dr. Duvall, you asked a question about what happened prior to 2018. The landings from 2012 to 2016, the landings never exceeded 51% of the quota. In 2017, they were at 98% of the quota. So that's what happened prior to 2018 when the council got working on this amendment. But if the motion passes, write a letter.
Any more comments? John Almeida?
This is just a wordsmithing suggestion. Just maybe specifically identify the longfin squid amendment 20, so it's clear on the record which one we're talking about.
Michelle Duvall?
Thank you. So appreciate the additional information from Mr. Penny. So I I wonder, let's see. I'm trying to get at something that would get us to an explanation for, a comparison of the approval of, MSB Amendment 20, which pertained to Longfin, versus the disapproval of this amendment. Again, Mr. Kalin raised that as a concern and something that I think would be helpful for industry to better understand. I think maybe what might be possible moving forward. So I'm wondering if it's relative to all 10 national standards and a comparison with MSB Amendment 20's approval. I don't know, Adam, if you would be amenable to that suggestion.
I think I'd need you to put it out there, right? Specifically what you want to change, make it clear, and then now that it's a motion in front of the whole body that we've had some debate, whether or not the body wants to accept that, I would go along or not, or whether you feel we need to change this via amendment. Are we at a point here? I suspect we're at least at a point that the original motion lacked specificity to get us something that we might be able to move forward with. I think we're at that point. So my goal was to put forward a motion that got us beyond that, at least provided us with something that we can contextually debate. Whether or not this body has heard enough to think anything we put forward at this point is going to get us some actionable response, I think that's a reasonable question still. We may be at a point that it doesn't matter what we put in this actionable specificity motion, we got what we got. Maybe that's what the service is telling us. So I'm at the point where I'm ready to move forward with the decision. Do we want to move forward with this motion? If yes, that means we as a council believe that we can put something forward and we want more specificity. And then if we want to further debate whether or not what those elements are of specificity, we can do so. But I'm not sure we've answered the question of whether we want to send a letter at all or not. And it's my opinion that an affirmative response to this motion at least makes it clear that we as a body do want to send something.
Dan Farnham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It sounds to me like listening to Mike Pentney that just going to get the same response back with more words here. At one point, we're going to have a discussion. Do we want to move forward with this action at all? I know everybody's reaching for a more detailed explanation, but why it was disapproved. But I don't know if we're going to get it, and I don't know. What we're doing is kicking the can down the road. Maybe we'll get enough information to make up our minds here. But at one point, we're going to have a discussion. Do we want to pursue this going forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. In the interest of time, because we have quite a few people need to catch flights, we're going to go ahead and call the motion. Adam, do you want to read it into the record?
I move to substitute that the council request a more detailed explanation of the amendment decision relative to all 10 national standards and mackerel squid butterfish Amendment 20's approval, longfin squid permits in parentheses, and what National Marine Fisheries Service recommends for future amendment development on fish hold provisions and consideration of historic participants with limited flexibility to pursue other fisheries.
I think we've had enough discussion on this. We're going to do a vote by hand. All those in favor, please raise your hand on the computer.
I'm not presently logged in.
Okay.
And I'm voting in favor.
Okay. Including Adam, that is 14. Everybody lower their hands. All those that disapprove of the motion, raise your hands. I see one. Lower your hand, please. Any abstentions? Two abstentions. Motion passes 14-1 to 2. This now becomes our main motion. All right, and this now becomes our main motion. It's already been read into the record. Let's again do a hand count. All in favor, please raise your hands. And Adam, you're back online now, correct?
Yes, thank you. My apologies.
All right, 16 yeses. Please put your hands down. All opposed, raise your hand. I do not see any abstentions. 1, 2. The motion passes 16-0-2. Peter, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Relative to the motion that was just passed, we do have another motion that comes out of committee in regards to fish hold, and I can read that into the record if you'd like.
Yes, please.
That the council explore options/requirements for a framework or amendment to implement a fish hold measurement and baseline limitations for the elex fishery.
Any questions or comments on the motion? Dan Farnham?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, sorry. In my mind, when I put this forward, it was to consider an option for the council to address capacity if it desired to, in the case that it didn't pursue going forward with resubmitting the amendment. I don't know right now if this motion could even apply. Should we consider tabling it until we get the information back from the regional administrator that we just asked for? Any thoughts? Thank you.
Adam?
I just wanted to offer that I was aware that we were going to have this other motion to debate. My rationale for including the fish hold provisions in the previous motion was that I viewed these two as as potentially mutually exclusive. We could get advice from the service about how to move forward. We could explore those options and requirements ourselves. There may be a benefit, perhaps as Dan just suggested, maybe we need that information back from the service before we do this. So his suggestion about potentially tabling or postponing this till we get some response may have some merit. But if staff feels there are things they could work on here, and if it's the will of this body to move forward with this anyway, then I would suggest we move forward with this motion without waiting for some response based on the last motion.
Shuttleball?
Yeah, I agree with what Adam just said about, the potentially moving forward with this motion and work. In my mind, when I second in this motion, I'll go back again to the fact that there are some strongly differing perspectives, within the fishery. I think the council, in order for us to make an informed decision about whether or not an action is warranted, this conversation needs to happen. It needs to happen with industry. It needs to happen at the advisory panel level. This may be a way to address some of the concerns about, capacity within the fishery. And the way I sort of envisioned this moving forward was that, staff would put together an information paper that contains information on, what the options might be for hold capacity requirements. I'm sure this is, there's information in the existing amendment that could be pulled into there, but also, what are current upgrade restrictions that are associated with, permits within other fisheries that might be on, ELEX boats. And so have an information paper that provides all of that. That is something that the advisory panel, industry can discuss and debate. And, that might take a couple of AP meetings, but I think that would inform this council's decision as to, whether and what action might be next. The council may decide that no action is necessary, but at least the conversation has happened, and I feel like that's important.
Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just so everybody knows, boats in the mackerel fishery have already been measured, and I'm sure there's some overlap with boats in the ELEX fishery, so it may not be tremendously complicated, but there is information available on fish hole measurements already for some vessels.
Sam Martin.
Sam Martin, Fishing Vessel Enterprises. There's a lot of complexity when it comes to baseline information, fish hole requirements. And we get into the baseline. I guess the question is this baseline information, or is it to be determined about the other aspects of the vessel outside of fish hole measurement? I'm holding a baseline permit letter in my hand right now, and I have 3 different baseline requirements of when I can upgrade my vessel to. And this is getting a little bit out of hand. I mean, we've had baseline requirements, but at what point do we just stick with what we have? I'm just saying it's complicated. Because of this, we've had to switch the permit around on this boat a few different times. And we have vessels right now that we've had to move around because of this type of thing, that if I get stuck on this, then I lose my flexibility in the other fisheries that I'm in. So I just think it's something we have to consider. We just can't just throw these requirements out because it changes all the baselines on our vessels. We have baselines already, which, prevent the over increase. Now, can they be manipulated to a degree? Yes, but at some point in time, I don't want a 4th or 5th baseline requirement on this vessel, which further reduces my flexibility. Thank you.
Any more comments? Chris Badsavage.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I'm not on mackerel squid butterfish committee, but like the other council members who were around the table a few years ago, I think we all got a crash course in this fishery. Certainly not an expert on it. And with the fact that I'm not as well versed as others, I would feel better about getting feedback from the service on everything we asked for in the previous motion, as well as information on fish hold measurement and baselines before moving forward on this. I mean, at best, I would abstain on this motion or possibly oppose it, but not oppose it because I don't think it needs to be done. I just don't think it needs to be done until we hear more from the service. I guess my concern, without knowing too much about the details of it, is I'd hate to see staff have to do this effort twice after getting feedback from the service. It almost seems better to wait on this until we get the information we asked for in the previous motion. Thanks.
Dan Farnham?
Yeah, I'd like to agree with what Chris just said there. I'd either oppose or abstain too. Thank you.
Adam?
Could I hear some input from staff or leadership about the merits of postponing this motion until, say, the April council meeting, which would give hopefully enough time to the service to respond to the other motion, as well as not forcing the hand here on a vote today on how to proceed?
Chris?
That makes sense to me, Adam.
Adam?
So hearing the discussion, I'm going to make that motion. I move to postpone this motion until the April council meeting.
We have a motion on the floor from Adam to postpone the vote. Do we have a second? Dan Farnham? All right, we have a motion on the floor by Adam Nowalski and seconded by Dan Farnham. And the motion reads, I move to postpone action until the April, let's see exactly what he's got here. Yeah. I move to postpone action until the April council meeting. Let's, think we can pass this one pretty simple. Are there any objections to the motion? I do not see any. Are there any abstentions? I do not see any. The motion passes by unanimous consent. Peter, is there anything else from the Squid Mackerel Committee?
So I guess that brings us full circle back around to where we were yesterday with the implementation plan. And I don't know when that discussion, Chris, you want to have happen. Just a reminder.
So we did have a discussion yesterday about this action in terms of continued development of an amendment. Jason, I think, has some very specific comments relative to that. Jason?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, if the council went down kind of the fishhold route, I could see that, being a pretty equivalent workload to the original implementation plan of, initiating an amendment that's there, and certainly have a number of tasks that I'll be working on early in the year. Either which way, this probably wouldn't have gotten kicked off immediately early in the year. So, I think I can imagine a situation where it's this action or the council decides to use the time that I would have spent on this for something else. I think early in the year, I'll be doing other stuff anyway. So, it might be okay. I think the pause might not necessarily kind of disrupt implementation plan workload things, because I'm the first couple months of the year, I'll be busy on other stuff regardless.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would recommend that we don't do anything at this point. So we have an implementation plan. We have an item in that implementation plan that addresses this issue. It's a little more general. It's not as specific as it relates to threshold measurement of baseline limitations, but I think there's an understanding of the steps that we're going to take over the next several months to address this particular issue. So I think we're fine. Unless someone feels otherwise, I would recommend that we don't make any changes to the implementation plan that we approved yesterday.
Any disagreement with Chris? Seeing none. Peter, anything else from the committee?
Nothing else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. With that, let's move on to our next, the Executive Director's report. Chris Moore.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Stephen, if you could put up the slides, please. For some reason, my screen, oh, there we go. Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. So there's a number of items behind tab 16 that we're going to talk about. I'll try to make it as quick as possible given the time. There's also 2 additional supplements that have been posted this week that you should take a look at if you haven't had a chance to look at those, and I will reference those as when we get to the end of the other items. Next slide, Stephen. But first, I want to let the world know that there's one less bachelor on the planet. Congratulate Dewey. Dewey got married in early November. Here's a picture from the wedding. Dewey says that he's going to wear this tux to our picture in February when we meet in DC. Congratulations, Dewey. Next slide. So here's a list of the items that we're going to be talking about. And like I said, I'll quickly go through those. The first one of those items is the meeting schedule. We will be meeting in Washington, the Hotel Washington, February 7th through 9th. I'm not sure exactly how that meeting is going to, what the agenda is going to look like at that meeting yet. So stay tuned. We'll provide detail as soon as we have it. There's a number of items that we've identified this week that we might want to talk about in February. But typically our February meeting is a relatively light schedule. So we'll see. Then you can look and see where we're meeting for the rest of the year, including Sunny's favorite hotel, the Yotel Hotel, New York City. The next item behind the tab is a letter dated November 30th. Typically, there's things that happen behind the scenes that the council may or may not be aware of. We have to do a report every year regarding our grant. We submitted that report this year, and NMSA liked it. It says the council continues to make impressive progress on all priorities, and especially appreciate their details and timeline of activities as presented. So that's good. Next item beyond the tab, we've had an email exchange. The council's aware of the training that each of you should complete by the end of February. That training is due by February 28th. This is the Preventing Harassment and Discrimination training. It's a module. It takes about 2.5 hours to complete. I haven't had an opportunity to do that yet, but I will by the end of February because staff also has to take the training. Before I move on, any questions about any of that before I move on to the next item? Seeing none. Mike Louisi, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And congratulations, Dewey. I had a little something I was going to say. I'll talk to you about it later. It just reminded me of the Top Gun comment about hearts breaking all over the world. So congratulations on that. Chris, can you remind me, I know that this has been brought up, can you remind me regarding the harassment training, whether or not the state government council members need to take that training? I can't remember. I thought there was an email a while back, but I can't remember what we ultimately decided on that.
So there was an email exchange. One of the state directors asked me if in fact they've already had training through the state process, whether or not they would have to take additional training from NOAA. The answer is that you're encouraged to do it, but you don't have to. It's not, you can, if you're a state employee and have already had the training, then you don't have to take the NOAA training.
Okay, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Any other questions before we move on? Seeing none. Next item behind the tab is something we touched on briefly yesterday during our implementation plan conversation. This has to do with the golden tilefish survey. This is an update that Jose has provided to me, basically detailing exactly where we're at with that, including the background, why we do a survey, survey development, how that's working, the folks that are going to be involved. certainly if there's any questions there, we can talk about it. The next item behind the tab, several of our council members attended CMOD meeting in Denver, Council Member Ongoing Development meeting. The focus there was ecosystem-based fisheries management, ecosystem approaches to fisheries management. As I understand it, I wasn't there. Brandon was there and several council members. It went very well. So there's the agenda. Certainly, if we have any questions or comments about that, we can talk about that. Next item behind the tab is a meeting report. And actually, this is something that if you haven't had a chance to look at, you should. This is a summary of the Council Coordination Committee meeting that occurred in October. I think it's an excellent summary of all the agenda items that were covered at that particular meeting. Gives you a good background as to where we're at from a federal perspective and individual council perspective on the number of issues and priorities. There's some things in there that I think would be of interest to everyone around the table. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, you should. The next item behind the tab after the summary is the actual agenda for that meeting. And again, you can take a look at that if you're interested, and certainly we can address any questions or comments you have about that. The next item behind the tab is a letter to Sam Rauch, basically detailing CCC's consideration of changes to the ESA policy directive to integrate ESA Section 7 with MSA. It's kind of a wonky title, but it's important as it relates to making things a little more efficient and effective from a council perspective. So if you take a look at that, certainly Carson can address any questions you might have about that. Carson's my lead on this particular activity. Stop there. Any questions, comments before I move on? Okay. There was another meeting in October. October is a busy month. We had a fall NRCC meeting. There's the agenda there. There's a couple things that happened at that meeting that we're going to talk about here shortly as it relates to action items. The thing right after the agenda is a response from Dave Gavea to two of the items that we asked about at that particular meeting. One was a permit VTR data request for the did not fish report. The did not fish report is something that we talked about a number of times over many council meetings. We talked about it again yesterday. So we basically asked for some very specific information, and that information is detailed in the following tables. So you have tables there that basically indicate the number of vessels that were issued for hire and recreation permits in 2020, 2021, 2022, and how many of them submitted at least one vessel trip report in that particular year. So you see the percentage categories by the individual permit type as well as all combined. So if we have any questions or comments about that, we certainly could address those. And we asked for that information to support the idea of whether or not we actually pursue dealing with this did not fish report. So it's interesting information, and certainly we can talk about it. Any questions or comments? Mike Pentney?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, just to clarify one thing that may not be obvious if you're just looking at the numbers in each row, is that if you notice, like for example, if you're looking at the first table for 2020, the total number of for-hire permits issued is 998. So the numbers that you see for each species are obviously, those are not cumulative, right? Because otherwise we'd be in the thousands. So when, so let's for the sake of argument, let's assume that everybody with a summer flounder for hire permit, the 885, that 879 of them also hold a black sea bass for hire permit. If they report a trip and they report summer flounder only, then they show up as the 250 that reported in the summer flounder row. For trips where they report black sea bass only, they show up in the 283 reports for black sea bass. So it's a little misleading to presume that of the 885 vessels with summer flounder for hire permits, only 28% of them submitted a VTR. That's not true. It's based on the species that they report. And so that can be a little bit confusing, but the actual percentage of for-hire permits that submitted a VTR at all is much higher. That's where the 42% comes from. They reported at least one trip under any of their individual permits. I hope that provides a little more context. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Other questions or comments about those tables or anything that we've talked about? Yep. So we would explore all this information if in fact we decide to pursue the did not fish report action. Again, that's something that we need to coordinate with the New England Council, and that information, all this information would be something that we would look at as we get into that particular action. Behind those tables are some summaries of exactly what we're talking about when we're looking at reporting for these various categories. To look at that. Also, Dave Gavea, in an email to me and others, basically wanted to let folks know that there would be a requirement for Surf Clam and Ocean Quahog vessel operators to begin using the Fish Online EVTR applications. That notice did go out to the clam folks, and so they're very well aware of the fact that they need to use these particular EVTR applications now. And some details there if you're interested. Next is a letter to Tom Neese, the Executive Director of the New England Council, Seafreeze, regarding EBFM. So there's been a number of action items relative to EBFM that are linked to the New England Fishery Management Council. They're the ones that are actually developing or considering this particular action. Read the letter from Seafreeze. I understand, Peter or Eric, that there was some action relative to EBFM taken by the New England Council last week. This may be a good time to report out on that if you want to talk about it. Peter.
So great. I'm just trying to access my my liaison report very quickly here. I did note it in my liaison report under NIMS priorities. NIMS chose not to include the EBFM priority, quote, begin development of a fully public stakeholder engaged MSC management strategy evaluation, end quote. So that they did not wish to further develop that. I unfortunately could not attend the priority portion of their meeting. It's the last thing they do on their final day, and my last flight's out are very early. So maybe I could ask Mr. Reed for a little follow-up on that, on what that discussion did entail. So thanks, Eric.
You, Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Moore. So the EBFM process is 7 or 8 years in development, and we're at a point now where there have been several public engagement sessions up and down the coast, and there's been a few workshops with the EBFM committee and our AP chairs. The council's decision is to essentially take the results of that, analyze what came out of those, and make some decisions whether or not to move ahead with a full-blown MSC. So there will be ongoing work on concluding what we've gotten to at this point. That's going to take some time in the year. The priority was removed for 2023. That does not exclude it from 2024. But that's where we're at. We're just going to hit the pause button while we analyze what has happened to date and what needs to happen moving forward in a methodical way. I hope that clarifies it for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Any questions or comments? Seeing none. The next item behind the tab is another letter from Seafreeze regarding comments on the monument amendment. It's basically, first line, we do not support amending the New England Fishery Management Council, Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, FMPs, to incorporate Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National monument fishing restrictions. This is something that we've talked about in the past. Basically, we've indicated to the service that we did not want to be involved in that particular amendment of our plans. I don't know if Mike Bentley, do you have any comments on that at this point?
Yeah, I was going to touch on this during my reports, but just because it's probably more apropos here. Appreciate the letter, particularly for Seafreeze and others that we heard from during the scoping period on our notice that we were, our scoping notice basically saying that we were soliciting input on our plan to undertake secretarial action to amend the council FMPs to reflect the requirements and restrictions of the monument. And, started thinking about that, and we're exploring our options to avoid amending the FMPs. I'm waiting on some specific guidance from our general counsel office, but the intent of what we're trying to work through is a way to be consistent and comply with the requirements of the monument declaration, but avoid amending the council FMPs for both New England and Mid-Atlantic. But stay tuned, and hopefully by February I'll be able to update everybody on our progress.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none. I mentioned earlier there's 2 additional supplements that are posted to the tab. One is a staff memo from Jason on river herring and shad. We talked about those species yesterday a little bit. In that particular memo, he details conversations that he's had with others regarding the portal. It's called the River Herring and Shad Run Data Portal. And some ideas there about what we may want to do with that from a staff council perspective, and some of the ideas relative to who might want to host that portal, basically to integrate East Coast river herring and shad data for folks to look at. So it's an interesting project, but not one that we are going to be that much involved with. Questions about that? And then last, we sent a letter to GARFO this week. Folks, I don't think most of the folks around the table have looked at the letter yet. It's dated December 14th. It's to Mike Pentney from Mike Louisi, basically talking about our concerns relative to the Amendment 23 to the Summer Flounder Scup Black Sea Bass Fishery Management Plan, which we approved back in August of 2021, and specifically the action that details how those allocations, those state allocations should be added to the federal FMP, and why that's an important thing to do. Basically, the letter was triggered through, excuse me, our review of the 2023 annual implementation plan that GARFO put together, which we appreciate. We took a hard look at that implementation plan and noted that that particular action was not included, and it's an outstanding action. And I think the letter speaks for itself. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be glad to answer any questions about the letter or anything else that I've talked about this morning. Mike Bentley.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, just in respect to the letter, actually really appreciate the letter because first and foremost, it shows that somebody actually read our implementation plan outside of me and a select few that had to put it together. So appreciate that people are taking a look at it. That's good to know. That's why we put it out there. Yeah, and the Black Sea Bass Amendment, that was not in there. It's just really an oversight, I think, probably due to some over-optimistic expectation that we would actually complete it in 2022 and therefore wouldn't need to put it on the 2023 implementation plan back when we started preparing the implementation plan. But that action did kind of take a back seat to higher priority for our staff that work on that plan, primarily trying to ensure that we had the harvest control rule framework through the process and out so that we could use it for the 2023 recreational fishing year. We had a long discussion about that and the implications of it a couple days ago. So we've just been prioritizing things like that and the specs. We will get back to the Black Sea Bass Amendment, and we'll let you know how that goes.
Okay, thank you. That's it for me. Unless there's other questions or comments, I'll turn it back over to you.
Joe Semino.
Thank you. No, I wanted to, getting back to the hotel. You know, the hotel certainly presented some unique experiences for us, but I have to say that so did this week, sharing a floor with a lot of college football players who decided robes and slippers are good enough and couldn't get to bed before 2 a.m. So thanks for that.
Peter.
Thanks. Chris, you mentioned the CMOD program, and I had attended that with others around the table, and I would just say that I thought it was excellent, an excellent program. It really provided a lot of insight into what other councils around the region are doing in regards to ecosystem and fisheries. And it was really just a great opportunity to better understand how all the various councils around the region actually work. So I thought it was very great. It was this cross-pollination, program that I for those who developed the program, I wish to commend them, and I hope the program continues to move forward with other subjects, hopefully on an annual basis. But I thought it was great. So thank you.
Seeing no more questions, thank you, Chris. Let's go on to organizational reports. Garfo, Mike Bentley.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I actually have quite a number of items to update the council on, but I will try to move quickly, and then if anybody has any specific questions, come back at the end. For mackerel, squid, butterfish, on October 22nd, we published a notice of availability for Amendment 23, which is the mackerel rebuilding plan. We are accepting the comment period on the notice of availability, which is the approval of the amendment portion. That closes December 27th. We published the proposed rule on the specific regs on November 2nd, and the comment period closes January 3rd. As you know, at the request of the council, we implemented interim measures to reduce mackerel catch while the rebuilding plan was being developed and under review. Those interim measures expire on January 13th. So we have a pretty narrow window between January 3rd and January 13th where we will be trying to wrap up our decision on the amendment, take action. So we can't guarantee that we'll have something in place by January 13th, but we're working as quickly as we can to address that. For bluefish, on November 15th, we published the proposed 2023 specifications consistent with the recommendations of the council and board. The comment period closed, and the final rule is expected to publish January 1st, or in time for the January 1st start of the fishing year. So look forward to that. Under summer flounder, scup, and sea bass, a few items. The harvest control rule framework that we were just discussing, that published today in the Federal Register, the proposed rule. The comment period closes on January 17th. So we'll be looking for people's comments on that and then trying to make a final decision and get a final rule out before we would publish the final rule on the 2023 rec measures. We formally approved the council's commercial and recreational allocation amendment, or Amendment 22, to summer flounder, scup, and sea bass on November 7th, and published the final rule to implement it on November 17th, which means that the new allocations are effective as of January 1st, and that changed. Then that was then carries through to the 2023 summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass specifications, which we published as a proposed rule on December 6th. The comment period for that closes on December 21st. We're required under a court order to publish final specs by the first of the year, which gives us an extremely narrow window between the close of the comment period and when we have to have new specifications in place. So right over Christmas and getting ready for the holidays. It's going to be very, very tight, but we're going to be working to get that done. Moving on to tilefish, we published the final rule for the 2022 and 23 specs and projected 2024 specs on November 5th. The specs are all status quo, so just no changes, but we did publish, finally get that rule out on November 5th. For framework 7 to tilefish, we published the final rule on November 10th. That sets the same specs for 2023 through 2024 for golden tilefish and modifies the process as requested by the council to be consistent with the NRCC stock assessment schedule. And lastly, and very importantly, changes the start date of the golden tilefish fishing year from November 1st to January 1st. On surf clam and ocean cohogs, on November 7th, we formally approved the excessive shares amendment passed by this council and published the final rule on November 23rd. So this obviously sets the amount of quota share cage tags that participants with IFQ authorization can hold. And we had previously published the notice of availability back and proposed rule back in August. So the new limits on quota share and annual cage tags will go into effect for the 2023 fishing year. November 21st, we published the final rule setting specifications for the 2023 fishing year, which is status quo, harvest quotas for surf clam and cohogs, and once again suspends the default surf clam minimum size. On December 1st, we announced a new requirement for Atlantic surf clam. Well, not new, but we announced a requirement for surf clam and ocean cohog vessel operators to begin using our Fish Online EBTR application, beginning with any trips started by February 1st. So we're suspending acceptance of paper logbooks. As you know, we had implemented a requirement for all federally permitted commercial as well as for hire vessels to submit their vessel trip reports electronically back in November of 2021. But we didn't include clam vessels because unlike all of our other commercial fisheries, clam operators have a pretty unique VTR based on the recommendations of the council way back when. And so it took us basically almost an extra year to figure out how to work through some of those differences. And the clam fishery, by and large, have been using Flounders, which is the center's EBTR app. And so we had to make some changes so that we could incorporate their reporting system and their unique reporting through our Fish Online application. So that is now done, and we'll begin requiring that in February. We also transitioned on November 15th, we transitioned surf clam and ocean cohog dealer reporting to our Fish Online web portal. So that was another shift. Maybe of some relevance to some members of the council, on December 9th, we published the final rule implementing Amendment 23 to the New England Council's groundfish plan. With long time in development, a significant amendment to the groundfish plan. Most of the requirement is effective January 9th, but there's one provision of the regs that are effective today, which allows sector trips fishing exclusively west of 7130 west longitude. They are excluded from the human at sea monitoring requirement, and that goes into effect today. On September 30th, we published the proposed rule to add the Omega Net Mesh measurement gauge as a permissible device for TrawlNet, and the comment period closed in October. We received no comments, so we're working on the final rule to implement that. And on December 29th, we notified the New England Council that we are revising the groundfish sector at sea monitoring coverage target to 80% for the 2022 fishing year. It had been 99, and we reduced it down based on available federal funding. Doesn't change the review rates for electronic monitoring video vessels, but it did change for the remainder of 2022 fishing year. For Atlantic herring, there may be some interest here, and unfortunately, I wish I had better news, but we are still working internally on approving the 2019 herring fishery disaster relief funding. As I said last week at New England Council, we received the complete application from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission back in October. And we've been conducting internal technical reviews that we have to undertake before we can submit the package to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and then they will conduct their review before any funds can be released. So we expect that and hope that that will happen early next year. The 2023-2024 Scallop Research Set-Aside Notice of funding opportunity closed in November. We received 19 proposals, which are being reviewed for technical merit and management relevance. We appreciate the support provided by our council partners to help review those applications. You heard an update on the work of our Atlantic large whale take production team. It's just wrapped up 2 years worth of work a couple weeks ago. I won't go through the details of that. And then we just touched on the Northeast Canyon and Seamounts Marine National Monument. I wanted to point out that there were 2 separate public scoping processes. We conducted one for our proposed amendments to the council FMPs in order to implement regulations. I discussed that, and we're pivoting on that. We're trying to pivot on that. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is conducting a separate scoping period unrelated to the regulations. It's focused on the development of the management plan, which is also required under the declaration for the monument. They are holding some public engagement sessions. They held one last week at Mystic Aquarium. They held another one. These were in person at New England Aquarium, and they hold they're holding 2 virtual public engagement sessions. One was last week on December 9th, but the next one is coming up on December 19th from 5:30 to 7:30. So if anybody's interested in listening to that and providing input, you can go to the Fish and Wildlife Services Monument Management Plan website and get details on how to register for that scoping session. If you just want to submit comments on the Monument Management Plan, Fish and Wildlife Service is accepting comments through the end of the year. And one last item. This was brought up at the CCC meeting that Chris mentioned, although it may have been missed by a number of people because it was missed by me, that the agency is considering reviewing the guidance that we have, our national standard guidelines that are published in the regulations on national standards 4, 8, and 9. And work to revise the national standard guidelines is a significant undertaking for the agency. It usually takes several years and requires opportunities for an interested public and the councils to provide input. So the agency is considering an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, or ANPR, to gather initial input to inform the steps the agency might take next to review and potentially revise our national standard guidelines for those 3 national standards. I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that because it definitely has an impact on the council. And that's all I have, Mr. Chairman, unless there's questions.
Any questions for Mike? Thanks, sitting here for 6 years at this table. That's the longest report I think I've ever heard you have to give. Let's move on next to the Northeast Fishery Science Center. Dr. John Hare.
Very much, Mr. Chair. I'll try to move through things quickly. We're still waiting for the FY22 budget. There were significant increases for NOAA fisheries to support activities related to offshore wind, activities related to developing climate science to inform management, and then a number of survey and data collection activities. So, the budget will be of great relevance to us at the Science Center, the regional office, and to the work and support we're able to provide the council. Our autumn bottom trawl survey and fall ecosystem monitoring surveys are completed. We have started posting a summary of those surveys soon after they're complete so that we can be fully transparent about what was accomplished and what was not accomplished. Our ecosystem monitoring survey lost 8 of the 18 days owing to crew shortages and COVID. and our autumn bottom trawl survey lost 14 of 58 days owing to multiple cases of COVID on the vessel on 2 legs. And this did result in a decrease in sampling frequency, primarily in the Gulf of Maine and Georgia's Bank. And so the impact to Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council species will be less than the impact to the New England Fisheries Management Council species. Our fall bottom longline survey was successfully completed in the Gulf of Maine. As I mentioned, in the President's budget, there are requests for survey and data collection activities. And so we're waiting to hear sort of on the funding decisions for the NEMAP survey and the Maine, New Hampshire survey. And we're also, our Northern Shrimp survey is also, waiting for funding decision, and part of our scallop survey is waiting for funding decision. So we're understand that we're getting well into FY23, and we still have a number of surveys that are waiting to find out if they're going to happen or not. Our observer program, the training and data quality group expects to clear the backlog of observer data by the end of the first quarter of 2023. And we'll keep the council informed on how we are doing there. Mr. Pentney talked about the at-sea monitoring spend plan. We had an in-depth conversation about that at the New England Council, and I'm happy to provide details if anyone's interested. And just to remind the council, Nicole Cabana, who's Deputy Director at Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and I have been meeting with each observer training class since the beginning of the year. And we talk with them about the importance of the data that they're going to be collecting, the importance of working with the crew and captains on the vessels and think about it as a partnership, the importance of safety at sea, and the importance of recognizing that they may be working individually on a fishing vessel, but there's a large group of people who are supporting them. The observer program, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and their employers. We have been very intentional about meeting with every training class just to impress upon them the importance of what they're doing and the importance of doing it well. So I think it's a good sort of move for us to spend more time with our observers. On the assessments, the assessment workload this past year was substantial. We had a conversation at the New England Management Council where a number of gaps in our service were identified, and I take full responsibility for those gaps. I know that we have not been delivering assessments in the manner that you all expect and that are required. Some of our assessment reports have been delivered late. We've not been able to fully support primarily the New England Council in terms of projections that they needed. We've had to extend a number of research track assessments. And we saw this issue at the beginning of the year. I saw this issue at the beginning of the year, and I did not act. I wanted to just let it play out and see if we could do what we had said we were going to do, and we weren't able to. So our plan going forward is we've approved 2 new hires into the Population Dynamics branch to relieve some of the capacity issues. We're going to look at the FY23 budget and see if we can approve any additional hires into that group, again, for the capacity. But it is dependent on budget. If we're not able to bring on new people into the Population Dynamics branch, then we'll need to go to that spring NRCC meeting and discuss how we reduce the assessment workload on the center to make sure that the workload is something that we can do and do well. The second issue which has come up with regards to our ability to provide assessments, it was featured in the review of the ELEX research track working group, is just the data accessibility and processing component. We've had a number of challenges there. The catch accounting and monitoring system, which I hope you all remember hearing about. That project has been taking us longer to get to completion. We're doing it jointly with the regional office, but it is nearing completion. And that should make the landings data and the discards data much more readily available. It will also solve an issue which Chris Moore pointed out at one of our early NRCC meetings, that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center catch accounting was different than the Greater Atlantic Regional Office catch monitoring. We were using two different systems, and sometimes they gave different numbers. So the catch accounting and monitoring system is a joint center regional office system, and there will be one accounting of catch, one accounting of landings, one accounting of discards. And I think that will help on the data issue. And then we've also been working with the councils to be able to have research track working group members have access to confidential data. That was another roadblock that we ran into. The ELACS research track was the first one. We run into it several other times. So we think we've got a solution to that issue. And once these two are complete, that will help us significantly on data accessibility and processing, but there are likely to be other barriers that arise. So I just wanted to let the council know what we're doing to do better in terms of our providing assessments. And then just a summary, we've totaled 130 stock assessment related meetings so far this year. I just want to thank everybody who has been involved in those. The new assessment process does involve a lot more external engagement and participation, collaborative activities. And so there is a lot of meeting. There's a load there, which we saw but didn't fully quantify. So just thank you, council staff, and all of you, the researchers who contribute to our assessment process. We've completed 23 management track assessments and track assessments this year. And we've completed 4 research track assessments. And then last week was a peer review for 2 other research track assessments. We currently have 6 research track working groups that are ongoing. Several are for Mid-Atlantic Council managed species. And we formed the research track steering committee to help advise that research track, both how the research tracks are functioning and then advise how we sort of choose research tracks for the future. So there's been a lot going on in the assessment world. Just a few more topics here. Cooperative research, there are cooperative research summits in January and February in Newport News, Virginia, and in Providence, Rhode Island. I think those are fully subscribed. So there's a lot of interest in cooperative research. There's a lot of value in investing in cooperative research. I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of those summits. With regards to offshore wind, we did finalize the federal survey mitigation strategy last week. That was jointly with BOEM. There's a very detailed action plan in that strategy. And we're starting to walk through those actions and continue to sort of report our progress here at the council. Science Center also continues to support the regional office in the regulatory process. The load is significant and the load is increasing. Just of note, there are new leased areas in the southeast off of North Carolina, South Carolina, and there are new leased areas off of California. And there will be lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico, probably in the first quarter. So, all the experience that we have with offshore wind in the Northeast, these other regions are going to need it. So I encourage you to work with the councils in these other regions. Mike and I are working with our NOAA fisheries counterparts in the other regions. But, let's hopefully have these other regions not have to relearn some of the hard lessons that we've already learned here. And then on the protected species, we heard a lot about the take reduction team activities, and that our Science Center team has created the decision support tool, which estimates entanglement risk. And they've been working very hard to support the take reduction team. And we also have our science highlights. And so if anyone's interested in getting our monthly science highlights, send me an email and I can make sure you get subscribed to the subscription service that we use. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for John? I do not see any. Oh, I got 2. Jason didn't.
Thanks. Just one kind of ancillary issue, that CAM's progress issue. Good to hear that's getting close to getting straightened out. It will, because it's impacted how council staff accesses data. It will kind of soon impact our ability to perform kind of certain standard critical analyses. And I think we've had some discussions with Garfo about, kind of figuring out how to access that, but that will, since some of the previous databases are not being updated in the same way, it will be come a kind of an increasingly critical issue. So just flagging that. It sounds like there's a path forward, so that's good. Thanks.
John.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I didn't go into the details, but there is going to be a peer review for CAMs. I don't have it in my notes. It's in January, and that will be open to the public, like all of our peer reviews. And I believe that, I don't know if it's scheduled yet, but there will be sort of an opportunity for council staff to work with the developers of CAMs to kind of walk through the system and hopefully learn about it.
Mike Petney.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just acknowledging that. I mean, the CAMS effort is really a joint effort between the regional office and the science center. We're working really well, really close together to end up with a final product that I think everybody's going to be pleased with. But recognize how important these systems are to council staff and a lot of other partners that rely on our data. I actually asked for the floor because I forgot two really important announcements under my report. So if I may, Mr. Chair. They weren't written down on the document that I read, so I sometimes forget things even though they're critically important. But all of you know Sarah Bland, who often sits to my right at these meetings or sits for me when I can't attend. She is no longer as of Monday, will no longer be my assistant regional administrator for sustainable fisheries because we promoted her to be my deputy regional administrator. So she'll be moving up into the front office and be my partner in leading Garfo. Really excited to have her in that position. Worked with her for a number of years and really excited that she'll be serving in that role. It'll be a very different role for her, but we're looking forward to it. And then that leaves a gap in our sustainable fisheries division. So while we work to permanently replace Sarah, Emily Gilbert will be serving as the acting ARA for sustainable fisheries, and you probably all know her from her work on a number of council FMPs. Her position as a team leader, branch chief, Travis Ford, who normally works on our Scallop FMP, will be stepping in to be the acting branch chief for Emily while she's serving in that position. So I wanted to make sure people were aware. All of this will be happening over the next few weeks. So you might start seeing emails from different people and wondering what's happening. So that would hopefully explains that. Thanks.
Seeing no more questions for John Hare. Thank you, John, for the report. Let's go to the NOAA Office of General Counsel. John Amita.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first item to report, the New York summer flounder litigation. You may recall that's a state of New York's challenge to the summer flounder amendment 22 on state commercial allocation. NIMS got a favorable decision in the district court. That case is on appeal. NIMS just filed its appellate brief this week, and New York will file its reply in early January, and we can expect oral argument at some point after that. Turning to right whale litigation, I just realized this Conservation Law Foundation Center for Biological Diversity case is approaching its 5th birthday in January. This case has been going on since January of 18. So I guess we can blow out the candles in January. We had, you may recall, we had a ruling in July against NIMS on the biological opinion, the fisheries biological opinion, and the 2021 MMPA rulemaking. The court ruled that the biological opinion violated the Endangered Species Act, and the rulemaking violated the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The court had asked the parties to submit briefs on what kind of a remedy order it should issue, And on November 17th, the court issued its ruling on remedy. Just briefly, as to the MMPA violation, the court remanded the rule to the agency without vacatur, meaning it didn't vacate the rule, but it ordered NMSA to complete a new rule by December of 2024. And as to the biological opinion, the court remanded it to NMSA, but it did not vacate it and held the question of vacatur in abeyance until after that rulemaking is completed and the court gets additional briefs from the parties at that point. So that litigation, we're going to be filing status reports to the court, but that, barring unusual circumstances, that case should be fairly quiet for the next couple of years. The other right whale case that's active, the Maine Lobstermen's Association case in the District of Columbia, you may recall that in September, the court ruled in favor of NMSA in this challenge to the same biological opinion and same rulemaking as in the other case. The court ruled in NMSA's favor, and the Maine Lobster Association filed an appeal to the DC Circuit. That appeal is moving on an expedited schedule, and MLA filed their opening brief in November. NMSA will file its appellate brief in this case next week, and MLA will file its reply brief scheduled for January 10th. And again, after that point, there may be oral argument. The two cases on industry-funded monitoring coming out of the New England Council. The first case, Loper Bright Fisheries. You may recall this one was brought in the District of Columbia, and NMSA got a favorable ruling in the district court and also in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The plaintiffs in that case have filed a petition for a writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court. Basically, the way it works with the Supreme Court is there's no sort of automatic right of appeal. You have to ask the court if it's willing to take up the case. So that's what that petition is seeking to have the Supreme Court hear the appeal. The government's response to that petition is due in mid-January, and we'll see what happens there. It's not too often that our cases, NMSA cases, end up before the Supreme Court, so it's kind of unusual for us. The second industry-funded monitoring case, the Relentless case in the District of Rhode Island, we're in the same posture that we were at the last meeting. The NMSA won in the district court, the plaintiffs appealed to the First Circuit, and that is fully briefed. There's been oral argument, and we're waiting for a decision from the court. That's all I have this month. If anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Any questions for John? I do not see any. Thank you for the report. Let's go to NOAA Office of Law Enforcement. I think Caleb Gilbert, you're on.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound fine.
Excellent. Sorry I couldn't be there in person today. Well, I'd like to start off today with a few year-end summary statistics from FY22 from October 1st, 2021 through September 30th this year. Northeast Division sworn staff conducted a total of 297 patrols. I know these numbers don't add up to 297, but 106 or more of those patrols occurred at sea, and 173 or more were land-based. There's also one air patrol where an officer partnered on a U.S. Coast Guard overflight. I think that was U.S. Coast Guard D1. Sworn staff issued 98 summary settlement offers in that time period for a total of just over $95,000. Over $74,000 of that has been paid. And that's the data that I pulled a month ago. So that $74,000 may have ticked up a bit since then. On the NOVA side, we assessed a total of over $345,000, and over $266,000 of that NOVA assessed total has settled. Again, that number may have ticked up again in the last a little bit in the last month. For case summary data from FY22, we opened a total of 983 cases, while closing 991. 407 cases remained open as of the close of the fiscal year. Now I'd like to move on to our some information related to our ongoing enforcement priorities within the Northeast Division. Some right whale and observer related highlights I'd like to share. Starting on Atlantic large whale take reduction plan compliance. You can see if you check out the written report for this meeting now or later on pages 8 and 9, figures 2 and 3, we compiled right whale, gear patrol, and violation statistics in the same fashion we compiled them for the council in early October in the third quarter FY22 written report provided to the council then. As shown in the written report, we have statistics combined from OLE and our enforcement partners showing 596 individual vessels inspected across 69 take reduction plan focused patrols. About 79% of those vessels were compliant with take reduction plan violations, a tick up from what we saw in the third quarter, which I believe is about 73% compliance rate. On to speed enforcement, the other prong of our right whale enforcement priority effort. This is also an FY22 year-end summary. We've now charged 23 speed rule cases from the 21-22 seasonal management area season. We assessed a total of over $200,000 in penalties in those cases, and 21 of those cases have now settled. We documented our specific speed enforcement efforts in the written report. Speed enforcement continues to involve all available technologies at our disposal, including AIS and various radar devices. And I mentioned we acquired an M2 mobile radar unit at the last council meeting. That was purchased primarily for enforcing SMA speed restrictions from land. Since the September meeting, various NED staff have been trained to operate the device, and it will be deployed in coming SMA operations over the winter. Speaking of seasonal management area ops, we conducted the first of the year off New York 2 weeks ago, targeting the main shipping channel coming into New York. Our officers identified multiple violations through the course of that operation, and those cases are currently ongoing. Now that our land and at sea SMA speed operations are underway for the coming season, I should mention our investigative support team staff continue to aid our agents and officers in the field. Moving on to our observer priority in the fourth quarter, OLE continued working with the observer programs, fisheries monitoring operations branch, FMO staff on port-specific roundtable events. We collaborated monthly with FMO to identify issues where compliance assistance and outreach may be provided to individual vessels or at individual ports. And we met ad hoc in the field at a couple port-specific outreach events. We also meet with FMO staff quarterly to engage on specific pressing needs and discuss our general collaboration strategy. More details on those activities are in the written report for this meeting, starting on page 9. In addition, our routine observer-related enforcement activities are listed in Table 3, starting on page 11. I know that's a lot of pages and tables, but OLE is not handling observer program-related casework any differently while we prioritize effort to aid the observer program. As I've reported to the council previously, there is no new law associated with this priority. The goal of the priorities continues to be to reduce the overall number of observer-related incidents and help encourage observer retention through our additional outreach activities, such as what I just mentioned. We will continue our observer priority efforts as we move further into FY23. I should also mention more recently in the current fiscal year, FMO staff and OLE collaborated to host 3 sexual assault, sexual harassment related groundfish industry training events. The last which was hosted 2 weeks ago, November 28th, I believe. Attendance was low at these events. Center and OLE staff plan to host more of these events in the new year, broadened to include other fisheries, and we're brainstorming methods to increase industry participation at future similar events. And that concludes my report today, Mr. Chairman. I'm available if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Caleb. Are there any questions? I see none. Thank you very much for your report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Move on now to the U.S. Coast Guard. Lieutenant Commander Matt Cayley.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. From the Coast Guard side, over the past 2 months, from October to November, we conducted about 149 fisheries boardings. This is a little lower than what we did in FY22 during this time, and that's likely due to a result that we've been sending some of our resources and our cutters down to our southeastern district in Miami to support some ongoing migrant interdiction operations from a surge that we've seen over the past couple of months with Cuba and Haiti. But of the boardings that we did do, we saw a lot of activity in the squid and HMS fisheries, so we expended a lot of effort into those fisheries, and also note that one trend that we've seen of late with the opening of the Mid-Atlantic access area is that the scout fleet has moved a little further north, which historically we have had a pretty good presence in, since they're right off the Mid-Atlantic access area there, but of late we haven't done a lot of scout boardings for that reason, moving a little bit further north. Also, from October to November, we issued 3 enforcement action reports, 2 of which were on wreck vessels that had yellowfin tuna on board that did not have a federal fishery permit when we conducted the boarding. And the third was on a commercial fishing vessel that had federal catch and gear in the water, but didn't have a federal fishery permit. Now, we also supported marine protected species, a request from the Marine Mammal Stranding Center, Station Barnegat Light off in New Jersey, was asked to see if they could relocate an injured whale and acquire some photos and to detail the extent of an injury. So we launched a small boat, but unfortunately we weren't able to locate it, so they returned to base. During this time, we have 3 ongoing operations that we're currently putting assets towards. One of them is our Atlantic striped bass op, where we target our stations and cutters will target striped bass fishing in the EEZ that migrate down during this time between now and December off New Jersey, and then further into January off of Virginia. We're also focusing on commercial fishing vessel safety for the oyster fleet vessels in certain areas in Virginia that have open seasons, open harvest areas down there. And then our last op we're running is Op Right Speed, which focuses on enforcing the seasonal management areas for vessels going 65 feet or greater that have to comply with that. So far, we've had about 10 or so hail outs since it opened in November, so between Delaware Bay and Virginia Port. So that's something that we'll be continuing to do throughout the management area, in addition to conducting joint ops with NOAA throughout the winter months. On the commercial fishing vessel safety efforts that we've done, we did 64 safety exams, which is comparable to what we did last year. We issued 43 decals, and we didn't have any terminations for commercial fishing vessel during October, November. On the search and rescue front, we had 3 cases. One was a collision/sinking, and then 2 other sinking cases that we provided support to. One was for the fishing vessel Fremont back in October that's home ported in Boston. The vessel was operating off the coast of Chincoteague, and it collided with a container ship, unfortunately, and it sank with about 13 people on board. Fortunately, there was a Good Samaritan in the area. The commercial fishing vessel Dresden and the research vessel Atlantis were there, and they were able to provide support, and they were able to pull off 12 survivors out of the water. And then we were able to transfer him to a small boat, and then the master of the vessel was airlifted. We were able to transport him back to land where he was cleared by EMS later on. For the 2 additional sinking cases that we had, one was in October for the back from Moore that sank off at Tangier Sound in Maryland while they were underway oyster fishing with 1 person on board. The vessel was flooding, and the operator couldn't locate the source, so he ended up being rescued by a Fairfield Fire Department vessel. And then recently, about a month ago, we had the Heather's Breeze, which sank in the vicinity of Gibbs Shoal in Biblico Sound with 2 people on board. The vessel was purchased, and it was recently in Wanchese, and it was en route to Sneed's Ferry when the vessel started to take on water about 2 miles offshore. So we were able to get a station boat out there which we thought was going to be rendering assistance with dewatering, but shortly upon their arrival, the vessel sank. So it was a pretty intense rescue. The small boat crew was able to get the 2 mariners on their boat, on the Coast Guard boat, as the mast was flipping over. So it was pretty good rescue there, and fortunate to be on the scene at the right time. On the outreach efforts we've done for commercial fishing vessel safety, our North Carolina sector down there has attended the Sneed's Berry Shrimp Festival for some outreach, and our district and sector units up in the northeast part of our in New Jersey and Maryland are going to be supporting the Ocean City, Maryland Expo and Atlantic City, New Jersey boat shows. And then lastly, we'll be conducting commercial fishing vessel safety training throughout the district for our boarding officers. And with that concludes my report, pending any questions.
Thank you, Matt. Any questions? Dewey?
Yeah, I was curious about, you said that there was a vessel that had fish on board and gear in the water and didn't have a federal permit. Well, what type of gear was it that he had in the water or she had in the water?
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question. From my understanding, it was trawl gear, and they had some about spiny dogfish on board, had some catch there, ground tending gear. Yeah, but they didn't have a permit on board, so when they conducted the boarding. So that's kind of what led to the violation there.
Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's more of a comment. And I really like to thank the 2 good Samaritans. The first one was the research vessel Atlantis, that's based in Woods Hole. That's one of John Harris' boats, I think. Anyway, if it's not, doesn't matter.
Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution.
Okay, sorry. But anyway, they sent their submersible over to the, I'm not submersible now, that's, Tremont was a submersible apparently, but they sent their inflatable over to the Tremont and took 12 of the crew to the Durston, which was standing by as well. The Durston's based in Cape May. So I really want to thank those boats for doing that. I mean, it's the law of the sea, but not everybody pays attention to the law, but they should be commended for their actions. And the Coast Guard helicopter crew took the captain off the boat literally moments before the Tremont went under. So you should be commended for that, and I really appreciate it. And the last thing is I appreciate the Coast Guard picking up the Yankee Pride last night, which is based in Point Judith. They were disabled 90 miles off of New Jersey, and the Coast Guard came to the assistance. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Seeing no more questions, thank you for the report. Let's move on to liaison reports. New England Council, Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my liaison report from last week's council meeting. It was held in Newport, Rhode Island. It was an in-person and a hybrid meeting. In regards to habitat, the council requested that NMSA maintain the Georges Bank dedicated habitat research area and the associated mobile tending bottom gear restrictions for an additional 3 years. Monkfish Committee report, we discussed monkfish yesterday and we'll strike that off. The Scout Committee report, the council completed work on Framework 36 and submitted to NMSA for rulemaking. In Framework 36, the council selected alternatives that would allow for 2 trips into closed area 2 at 12,000 pounds each for a total of 24,000 pounds, and they authorized 24 days at sea. The action also contains limited access general category IFQ components such as days at sea and access area trips based on 5% of the overall scallop ABC and the updated OFL. The council also selected Northern Gulf of Maine alternatives that would set the 2023 Northern Gulf of Maine TAL at 434,311 pounds. Under spiny dogfish, the council moved that the management uncertainty buffer be set at 0% and with the other specification used by the monitoring committee to result in the 12 million pound commercial quota. I believe that's the same motion that was made here at this council. It just mirrors the motion that was made here. And that was actually a motion to substitute. They came out with the 5% buffer. They discussed it, removed it. There were people there from the fishery who participated from the audience, and it was very beneficial for the council to hear their rationale in regards to why they needed that to be set at 0. Groundfish Committee, they take a lot of actions on groundfish up in New England, and I'm just going to touch on some measures. you know, they put some measures in place for rebuilding the Gulf of Maine cod. They revised their specifications for fishing year 2023 through 2024-5, with the exception of whitehake, Gulf of Maine haddock, and Georges Bank cod. They removed the management uncertainty buffer for sectors if the at-sea monitoring target coverage rate is set at 90% or greater for fishing year 2023 for Gulf of Maine haddock and whitehake. They set the 2023-2025 ABCs for Gulf of Maine haddock. They set the 2023 ABC for whitehake, and they set the Georges Bank cod ABC, and they revised their specifications for recreational catch target for the Georges Bank cod. NIMS priorities, we already discussed EBFM. In regards to Amendment 8, and if you recall, that was the herring amendment, they chose to revisit Amendment 8, which was the inshore midwater trawl closure. So they've added that to their 2023 priorities. They also chose not to pursue the herring spawning framework in 2023. That doesn't mean that that can't come back up in 2024. They also made as a priority that the scallop and habitat committees develop an action for access to the Northern Edge HMA, including development of access area program for a modified area as a 2023 work priority. Please note, my report is based on draft motions that were made last week at the council meeting. The motions have not been finalized yet and have not been posted to their website, so everything's considered in draft form. And that concludes my report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions? Seeing none, let's go to the South Atlantic Council. Dewey?
Yeah, the South Atlantic Council met in Wrightsville Beach last week, and it was a 5-day meeting, and they had a full agenda. And a lot of things that were discussed there had to do with that they have committee meetings that last a day and a half for snapper grouper or mackerel, Spanish and king mackerel. And some of the things that come out of that was they're working on regulatory amendment 35, which is the release mortality reduction for red snapper. You had the snapper grouper AP chairman give a report. You had the SSC chairman Jeff Buckle give a SSC report. We also had a presentation about management strategy evaluation updates. You had the councils working on a snapper grouper amendment 46 recreational permit and reporting. You also had approval for snowy grouper amendment 51, which is a 43% reduction in the harvest of the stock. So that's going to have some effect on people. And you also had golden tilefish and blue line tilefish snapper grouper amendment 52 was considered for final approval, which would also have some reduction in recreational catch of blue line tilefish, and it will also increase the quota in the golden tilefish given the recent stock assessment. They're also going out for amendment 46 recreational reporting and permitting. We're going out for scoping. They're going out for public hearings on amendment 35, which is release mortality reduction. For red snapper, there was also a presentation of the scenario planning similar to what we had here yesterday, and he followed the same procedures as he did before. And so you also had the king mackerel and Spanish mackerel reports, and it looks like the Spanish mackerel is getting revised back for a little more further work on some stuff before that will be accepted. And they had best fishing practices outreach and program to inform snapper grouper folks on regulatory amendment 35 about best fishing practices. You had updates on the large Atlantic well take reduction team from Charlie Phillips and Habitat Protection Advisory Committee Advisory Panel report from Cindy Cooksey. And you also had a update on Dolphin MSC strategy, stakeholders meeting updates, which will be happening here in January. So it was a busy full week, and if you want to read the agenda and stuff, you can look under the tab 17 in the briefing book. And thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Dewey. Any questions for Dewey? Comments for Dewey? Seeing none, is there any new business or other business that needs to come before the council? Seeing none, I think everybody's about ready to get out of here. Sonny Quinn?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to apologize. I did have a question for Mike Pinkney. When he did his report, he mentioned the large whales take reduction team meeting, and he said he had no comment. And I would just like to know that I know there was no consensus made at that meeting, and I wanted to ask the question of what the next steps are going to be.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for your comment or your question. So the next steps will be that we have a lot to work through in terms of there were quite a variety of recommendations and suggestions made through the TRT process at the most recent meetings. Correct, no complete consensus was made, but there were put forward a number of options for us to consider in the different regions. So we'll be working through those. Our plan is to continue to work, particularly with our state partners, and work through the options, develop a draft environmental impact statement and proposed rule, which we expect to get out next year, and continue to work through the process that way. But we can certainly stay in touch with, through the councils, providing updates along the way as we make progress over the next year or two. We do have a deadline of December 9th, 2024 under court order to have this rulemaking complete. So that's the deadline that we're working towards, roughly just under 2 years from now.
Okay, thank you very much, and I apologize for the late question. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sonny. I think we're just going to wrap this up. I want to thank council staff for another great meeting, for all you guys do. You're behind the curtain a lot of time. We don't get to see you, we don't get to hear you, but thank you for all you do. With that, about to call the meeting to an end. I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Be safe on your travels home because it doesn't look fun outside. I'm starting to think if I'm going to be running a meeting, the weather's going to be crap. I don't know what that is all about. But with that, we're going to call the meeting to an end, and I'll see everybody in 2 months about 30 miles west from here. See ya.
Thank you.